They say a queen wears her crown even in her sleep. But what happens when she wakes up one night and realizes the man lying beside her has been plotting her funeral since the wedding day? Queen Evelyn Lancaster thought she knew what betrayal tasted like. War taught her that. Politics taught her that. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared her for the moment she found those letters. 10 years of marriage, 10 years of bleeding for an empire that was never meant to be hers. And tonight, in the hidden chamber behind the ballroom where they first danced, she's about to discover that every kiss was a transaction, every promise a calculated lie. This isn't just a story about a woman scorned. This is about a queen who stops begging and starts hunting. So buckle up, because by the end of this, you're going to need to hit that like button just to process what's coming. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my tribe is watching from. Trust me, you don't want to miss how this ends. Bye. The winter ball was supposed to be perfect. That's what everyone kept saying anyway. The servants whispered it in the hallways. The courtiers repeated it like a prayer. Even the musicians seemed to play with extra reverence, as if the notes themselves could will perfection into existence. Evelyn Lancaster stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, watching the empire celebrate itself. Chandeliers dripped golden light onto marble floors. Women in silk gowns twirled like expensive ghosts. Men in military regalia laughed too loud, their medals clinking with each gesture. The whole scene looked like a painting, beautiful and frozen and utterly lifeless. She felt Adrian's hand on her lower back before she saw him. 10 years of marriage had taught her to recognize his touch instantly. Firm, possessive, always just a little too tight. "Come dance with me," he said. His voice carried that particular tone he used when he wanted something from her in public. "I'm tired, Adrian. You're the queen. You don't get to be tired during the winter ball." His smile never reached his eyes anymore. Maybe it never had. Evelyn couldn't remember when she'd stopped checking. She let him lead her onto the floor anyway. That's what she always did. That's what she'd been doing for a decade, letting him lead while pretending it was a partnership. The orchestra swelled. Adrian pulled her close, and for exactly 3 seconds, she tried to remember what it felt like when his touch didn't make her skin crawl. "You look beautiful tonight," he murmured against her ear. "Thank you. That dress cost a fortune, worth every coin." Of course it was about the money. Everything was always about the money. Her family's fortune specifically. The Lancaster wealth that had turned a struggling warrior prince into Emperor Adrian Vale. She'd brought him power wrapped in a wedding dress, and he'd spent 10 years bleeding it dry. The song ended. Adrian released her immediately, his attention already drifting toward a cluster of foreign dignitaries near the wine table. She watched him walk away, his shoulders broad and confident, every inch the emperor. Nobody else could see the rot underneath. Nobody else had spent 10 years studying the architecture of his lies. "Your Majesty." Evelyn turned. Lady Thorne stood beside her, face flushed from dancing, eyes bright with wine and gossip. "Quite a celebration," Lady Thorne said. "Indeed. The Empress looks radiant as always." There was something in the way she said it, a tiny crack in the veneer of courtesy. Evelyn had been navigating court politics long enough to hear what people didn't say. "You're too kind," Evelyn replied, her voice cool and measured. Lady Thorne leaned in slightly, close enough that her next words wouldn't carry beyond Evelyn's ears. "I saw him earlier, in the East Wing, with her." The music seemed to get louder. The ballroom felt suddenly smaller. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Evelyn said. "Of course not, Your Majesty." Lady Thorne's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Forgive me for speaking out of turn." She disappeared into the crowd before Evelyn could respond. Not that there was anything to say. Everyone knew about Adrian's mistress. The whole court knew. They probably took bets on how long Evelyn would pretend not to notice. The girl was young, 23, maybe 24. Some minor noble's daughter with good breeding and better political connections. Adrian had installed her in a suite of rooms in the East Wing 6 months ago. He thought he'd been subtle about it. Men were always so convinced of their own cleverness. Evelyn moved through the ballroom like she was made of marble. Smile fixed, posture perfect, every inch the gracious queen. She accepted compliments about her dress, her hair, her tireless dedication to the empire. She listened to Lord Ashford complain about grain taxes. She laughed at Ambassador Chen's terrible joke about horses. She played her part flawlessly because that's what she'd been trained to do since birth. All the while, something cold and sharp was crystallizing in her chest. The ballroom opened onto a series of smaller chambers designed for private conversations and political maneuvering. Evelyn knew these rooms intimately. She'd spent countless hours in them, negotiating peace treaties and trade agreements while Adrian took credit for her work. Tonight, she found herself drifting toward the Western Gallery, away from the music and the crowd. She needed air. She needed space. She needed to stop feeling like her own skin was trying to suffocate her. The gallery was empty. Moonlight spilled through tall windows, painting everything silver and shadow. Evelyn pressed her forehead against the cold glass and tried to remember who she'd been before she became Adrian's wife, before she became the Empire's perfect queen, before she learned that love was just another word for strategic asset. The sound of voices drifted from somewhere nearby. Male. Urgent. She recognized one of them immediately. Lord Blackwood, Adrian's closest advisor, and the only man who'd stood beside him since before the Empire existed. The voices were coming from behind the Western Wall. Evelyn knew every inch of this palace, but she couldn't place where those voices were originating. She followed the sound, her footsteps silent on thick carpet. The voices grew clearer. Definitely Blackwood. And someone else. Someone who sounded like Adrian. She stopped breathing. There was a door, small, almost invisible in the ornate paneling of the wall. She'd passed this hallway 1,000 times and never noticed it before. The voices were coming from behind that door, muffled but distinct. Evelyn's hand moved without conscious thought. The door wasn't locked. It swung open silently, revealing a narrow stone passage that definitely hadn't existed on any of the palace blueprints she'd reviewed during renovations 3 years ago. The voices were closer now, clear. She moved like smoke, silent and purposeful, following the passage as it curved downward. Torchlight flickered ahead. The passage opened into a small chamber, richly furnished with chairs and a desk covered in papers. Adrian and Blackwood stood with their backs to the entrance, studying documents spread across the desk. "How much longer?" Blackwood asked. Adrian's laugh was cold. "Another year. Maybe less. Once the Thornwood alliance is secured, we won't need the Lancaster fortune anymore. The Empire will be self-sustaining." "And the Queen?" Evelyn's blood turned to ice. Adrian sighed like a man discussing the weather. "She's served her purpose. Once I marry into the Thornwood line, we can arrange something quiet. An accident during travel, perhaps. Or illness. The court physicians are remarkably creative when properly motivated. The young one knows to keep her mouth shut. Isabel understands her position perfectly. She'll make a suitable replacement, young enough to give me heirs, smart enough to stay out of politics, and grateful enough to never question my authority." Blackwood chuckled. "Not like the current model." Adrian's voice dropped lower. "Evelyn was useful when I needed her family's support, but the woman has become insufferable, always questioning my decisions, always trying to insert herself into matters that don't concern her. She actually had the audacity to suggest we reduce military spending last month. God forbid." They both laughed. The sound echoed off stone walls, bouncing around the chamber like something diseased. Evelyn stood frozen in the passage, her hand pressed against cold stone to keep herself upright. 10 years. 10 years of believing his lies. 10 years of standing beside him through war and peace, through political storms and assassination attempts. 10 years of giving everything she had to build an empire she thought they were creating together. All of it had been theater. Every kiss, every promise, every moment of manufactured intimacy had been nothing more than a long-term investment strategy with a planned obsolescence date. She'd known he didn't love her. She'd made peace with that years ago. But this was something else entirely. This was cold-blooded, premeditated erasure. He wasn't just planning to divorce her or exile her. He was planning to delete her from existence so completely that history wouldn't even remember she'd ever been a problem. Adrian shifted the papers on the desk. Evelyn caught a glimpse of her own signature on several documents: financial transfers, land deeds, military appointments. Her authority, wielded without her knowledge, signing away her family's legacy piece by piece. The letters were stacked neatly in a leather portfolio on the edge of the desk. She could see the wax seals from where she stood. Lancaster blue, her family crest, correspondence she'd never seen before, bearing her name and seal, authorizing transactions she'd never approved. He'd been forging her signature. For how long? Months? Years? We should return to the ball, Blackwood said. People will notice our absence. Adrian nodded. Destroy these drafts. I want no paper trail. Understood. They moved toward a different exit on the far side of the chamber. Eveline pressed herself deeper into the shadows of the passage, barely breathing as they passed. When their footsteps faded, she waited exactly 2 minutes by her heartbeat, which was pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs, then moved into the chamber. Her hand shook as she reached for the letters. There were dozens of them. She read quickly, her mind cataloging each fresh horror. Letters to foreign governments promising Lancaster trade routes in exchange for military support. Letters to banking consortiums using her family's credit as collateral for Adrian's personal expansion projects. Letters to nobles throughout the empire, written in her voice, expressing opinions she'd never held and making promises she'd never authorized. And underneath all of that, tucked into a separate envelope marked with Adrian's personal seal, were the love letters. Not love letters he'd written to her. Love letters he'd written to other women over the past 10 years. A rotating cast of mistresses and political conquests, each one addressed with the same passionate vocabulary he'd once used in letters to Eveline herself. The same phrases. The same promises. Copy-pasted devotion distributed to whoever was currently useful. She found letters to Isabel, the current favorite. Dozens of them. In the most recent, dated 2 weeks ago, Adrian wrote in florid detail about his plans for their future together. How he couldn't wait to make her his official empress. How Eveline was nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. How their wedding would be the grandest celebration the Empire had ever seen. Eveline's vision blurred. She realized distantly that she was crying, hot tears tracking down her face and dripping onto priceless correspondence. She never cried. She'd trained herself out of that weakness years ago, but something was breaking inside her chest, something fundamental and irreparable, and tears seemed like the least destructive way for it to escape. She gathered the letters, all of them, stuffed them into the leather portfolio, and held it against her chest like a shield. Then she left the chamber exactly the way she'd come, through the hidden passage and back into the western gallery. The winter ball was still happening, music still played, people still danced and drank and pretended their lives had meaning. Eveline stood in the doorway, watching the celebration continue without her, and felt something inside her die, not her heart. That had stopped working years ago. It was hope that died. The last tiny, pathetic fragment of hope that maybe things could get better. That maybe Adrian was just distant, just stressed, just struggling with the weight of empire. That maybe if she tried harder, loved him better, supported him more perfectly, he might remember why he'd married her in the first place. But there was no why. There had never been a why. There was only what, and the what was simple. Her money, her family's power, her political connections. She'd been an acquisition, a merger, a hostile takeover disguised as romance, and now she was obsolete. Your Majesty. Eveline turned. One of the palace guards stood nearby, young and concerned, clearly unsure if he should be addressing the Queen directly. Are you well? You look almost. I'm fine, she said. Her voice came out perfectly steady. 10 years of practice made that possible. I need you to deliver a message to my personal chambers. Tell Marian I'll be retiring early tonight. She's not to wait up. Of course, Your Majesty. He hurried off. Eveline watched him go, then turned back to the ballroom one last time. Adrian was dancing with Isabel, right there in the middle of the floor, in front of everyone, not even bothering to hide it anymore. The girl was laughing at something he'd said, her head thrown back, young and pretty, and completely unaware that she was dancing with a man who would discard her the moment she stopped being useful. Lady Thorne caught Eveline's eye from across the room, raised her wine glass in a tiny, knowing salute. Eveline didn't respond. She simply turned and walked away from the celebration, from the music, from the empire that had consumed her entire adult life. She walked through empty corridors, past guards who snapped to attention as she passed, past servants who bowed and murmured greetings she didn't acknowledge. She walked until she reached her private chambers, separate from Adrian's for the past 3 years. Another humiliation she'd pretended not to notice. Marian was there, already preparing the room for evening, despite the early hour. Your Majesty, I didn't expect— Leave, Eveline said quietly. Marian's eyes widened. Your Majesty? Leave. Now. Tell the guards I'm not to be disturbed for any reason. If the Emperor himself comes to this door, you turn him away. Do you understand? Marian stared at her for a long moment. Whatever she saw in Eveline's face made her pale. Yes, Your Majesty. She curtsied quickly and fled. Eveline locked the door behind her. Then she walked to the center of her chambers, still clutching the leather portfolio, and finally let herself feel it. All of it. The rage and humiliation and grief and betrayal, all the emotions she'd been suppressing for 10 years, came flooding through her in a wave so powerful she actually staggered. She wanted to scream. She wanted to set fire to the entire palace and watch it burn. She wanted to march back to that ballroom and expose Adrian in front of every noble in the empire, watch his perfect facade crumble into ash. But she didn't do any of those things. Instead, she sat down at her writing desk and began reading the letters again. Slowly this time. Carefully. Taking notes. Memorizing names and dates and transactions. Building a map of Adrian's corruption in her mind, piece by careful piece. Because Eveline Lancaster hadn't survived 10 years of court politics by being impulsive. She'd survived by being smarter than everyone else in the room, by playing the long game, by understanding that revenge wasn't a dish best served hot or cold. It was a dish best served with surgical precision at exactly the right moment to cause maximum damage. The ball ended near midnight. Eveline heard the sounds of celebration fading, guests departing, the palace settling into its nighttime rhythms. At some point, Marian knocked softly and left a tray of food outside the door. Eveline ignored it. She read until her eyes burned, until she'd memorized every damning word, until she understood the full scope of what Adrian had built on the foundation of her family's legacy. It wasn't just embezzlement. It was systematic dismantling. He'd been quietly seizing control of Lancaster assets for years, using her authority as cover while redirecting wealth and power into his own name. The Lancaster fortune that had funded the empire's rise was being converted into Vale property, acre by acre, coin by coin. And the military appointments? God, those were worse. Adrian had been installing his own loyalists in key positions throughout the imperial forces, replacing the generals who'd originally supported the Lancaster family alliance. He was building an army that answered to him alone, independent of any traditional noble power structure. If she'd waited another year, she would have had nothing. No wealth, no military support, no political leverage, just a target on her back and a convenient accident waiting to happen. The realization settled over her like frost. She was going to die. Not might die. Was going to. Unless she moved first. Dawnlight was creeping through the windows when Eveline finally set down the last letter. Her hands had stopped shaking hours ago. Her tears had dried. What remained was something cold and clear and absolutely certain. She unlocked a drawer in her desk and removed a small leather-bound journal. It had been a gift from her mother years ago, before the marriage, before everything. She'd never written in it, never found words adequate to match the elegant blank pages. Tonight, she began filling those pages with names. General Marcus Thorne, commander of the Eastern Legions, married to Lady Thorne, who'd warned her tonight. A man who'd served her father before transferring loyalty to the Empire. She wrote his name carefully, then added notes about his history, his weaknesses, his ambitions. Lord Ashford, master of coin, constantly complaining about Adrian's spending but lacking the spine to refuse imperial demands. She wrote his name and underlined it twice. Ambassador Chen, foreign relations, smart enough to see through political theater but pragmatic enough to ignore it for the right incentives. She wrote for hours, building a catalog of everyone in the empire who might be persuaded to shift their loyalty away from the emperor. Not because they liked her, she had no illusions about that, but because Adrian had made enemies during his rise to power. People who'd been stepped on, overlooked, humiliated. People who might enjoy watching him fall if given the opportunity. When she finished, she had 43 names, 43 people who represented cracks in Adrian's perfect empire, 43 places where she could drive a wedge and watch everything shatter. She locked the journal away and finally allowed herself to sleep. Not in her bed. She couldn't bear the thought of lying down, of being vulnerable. But in the chair by the window, still dressed in her ball gown, the leather portfolio of letters clutched against her chest like armor. She dreamed of fire, of the palace burning, of standing in the ashes while Adrian screamed her name, finally understanding that he'd underestimated the woman he'd tried to erase. When she woke, the sun was high and someone was pounding on her door. "Your Majesty!" The voice was panicked. "Marian, Your Majesty, please," the Emperor demands. Eveline stood slowly, joints stiff from sleeping in the chair. She walked to the door and opened it exactly 6 inches. Marian stood in the hallway, flanked by 2 of Adrian's personal guards, all of them looking nervous and uncomfortable. "The Emperor requires your presence at breakfast," Marian stammered. "Tell the Emperor I'm indisposed." "Your Majesty," he was quite insistent. "Then he can be insistent outside my chambers. I said I'm not to be disturbed." She closed the door in their faces and locked it again. Heard muffled conversation in the hallway. Heard one of the guards say something about forcing entry. Then heard Marian's sharp whisper reminding them that she was still the queen and breaking down her door would constitute an act of treason. The voices faded. Eveline smiled for the first time in hours. Let Adrian wait. Let him wonder. Let him start to realize that something had shifted, even if he couldn't yet identify what. She'd spent 10 years being the perfect wife, the obedient queen, the convenient asset. Starting today, she was going to remind the Empire that she'd been born a Lancaster before she ever became a Vale. And Lancasters didn't break. They burned the world down rather than surrender. Eveline turned away from the door and began planning her war. Not with armies, not yet, but with something far more dangerous in the imperial court. She was going to weaponize truth. Every secret Adrian had buried, every crime he'd committed, every person he'd betrayed on his way to the throne, she was going to dig it all up and drag it into the light. But first, she needed allies, real ones. Not the fair-weather courtiers who'd abandoned their principles for proximity to power, but the people Adrian had crushed on his way up. The displaced nobles, the dismissed generals, the overlooked advisors who'd watched him steal credit for their work. She needed an army built on shared grievance, and she knew exactly where to start. General Marcus Thorne maintained a private residence outside the capital. Officially, it was for security reasons. A commander of his status needed fortified quarters. Unofficially, everyone knew it was because he couldn't stomach living in the palace anymore, watching Adrian Vale play emperor with power he hadn't earned. Eveline composed a letter. Brief. Careful. A request for a private meeting to discuss matters of imperial security. Nothing that would raise suspicion if intercepted, but specific enough that Thorne would understand this wasn't ordinary court business. She sealed it with her personal crest and summoned one of her own messengers. Not the palace courier service. Those men reported directly to Blackwood. She used a young woman named Sarah who'd served the Lancaster family for years, someone whose loyalty predated the Empire. Deliver this personally, Eveline said. Don't use the main roads. And Sarah, if anyone asks where you've been, you were running personal errands for me. Shopping, nothing interesting. Sarah nodded once, understanding immediately that something significant was happening, and disappeared. Eveline sent 5 more letters that day, each one carefully worded, each one delivered by a different trusted messenger, each one to someone who had reason to hate Emperor Adrian Vale. Then she waited. By evening, Adrian finally came to her chambers himself. She heard his footsteps in the corridor, heard the guards scramble to attention, heard him dismiss them with an irritated wave she could practically see through the door. He knocked, polite, controlled. Eveline. She didn't answer. Let him stand there. Let him feel what it was like to be ignored. Eveline, open this door. Still nothing. His voice hardened. I'm not asking. Open the door or I'll have it removed. She almost laughed. But she walked over and unlocked it, pulling the door open to find Adrian standing there in full imperial regalia, face tight with anger barely held in check. You missed breakfast, he said. I was indisposed. You've been indisposed all day. His eyes searched her face, trying to read what had changed, looking for the crack in her mask. She kept her expression perfectly neutral. I wasn't feeling well. I'm better now. Good. Then you can join me for dinner. We have guests. The Thornwood delegation arrived this afternoon. Of course they had. The alliance Adrian was building to replace her family's support, the final piece of his plan to make her obsolete. I'll be there, she said. 1 hour. Don't be late. He turned and walked away without another word. No concern for her health, no curiosity about what had kept her locked in her chambers, just irritation that she'd disrupted his schedule. Evelyn closed the door and leaned against it, breathing slowly. 1 hour. She had 1 hour to prepare herself for dinner with the people who were going to help Adrian erase her. She chose her dress carefully. Not the elaborate gowns Adrian preferred, designed to display wealth and status. Tonight she wore something simpler. Lancaster blue. The color of her family, the color she'd been born into before Adrian had covered her in veiled crimson and gold. It was a small rebellion. Probably no one would even notice. But she'd know. And sometimes that was enough. Marian helped her prepare, working in silence, reading the tension in Evelyn's shoulders, and knowing better than to make small talk. When she finished, Evelyn looked in the mirror and barely recognized herself. She looked like a queen. Not Adrian's queen. Her own. Us. The dining hall was already full when she arrived. Adrian sat at the head of the table, surrounded by the Thornwood delegation. Lord Thornwood himself, a calculating man with shrewd eyes and an impressive military record. His daughter Genevieve, beautiful and ambitious, and exactly the type of woman who'd see marriage to an emperor as an opportunity rather than a trap. Isabel was there too, seated just close enough to Adrian to make a statement. The mistress, meeting the official alliance partners. It was brazen even by court standards. Evelyn took her seat at the opposite end of the table. The arrangement spoke volumes. An empress should sit beside her emperor. Instead, there was 10 feet of polished wood and political maneuvering between them. Your Majesty, Lord Thornwood said, inclining his head, you look radiant this evening. Thank you, Lord Thornwood. I trust your journey was pleasant as any journey can be in winter. The conversation continued in that vein. Polite, meaningless. Everyone performing their roles perfectly while the real negotiation happened in glances and carefully chosen words. Evelyn ate slowly, watching, listening, building a mental map of who was allied with whom, who held power, who wanted more. Adrian was charming. He always was with people he wanted something from. He told stories about military campaigns, downplaying his failures and embellishing his victories. He laughed at Lord Thornwood's jokes. He complimented Genevieve on her dress, her intelligence, her grace. And through it all, he never once looked at Evelyn. It was masterful, really. The way he erased her from the conversation without ever explicitly dismissing her. She was there, sitting at the table, but she might as well have been furniture. Just another expensive decoration in the imperial collection. Genevieve noticed. Her eyes flickered between Evelyn and Adrian, noting the distance, the lack of warmth, calculating what it meant for her own future prospects. Smart girl. She'd do well as empress, right up until Adrian decided she'd outlived her usefulness. The dinner dragged on, course after course, wine flowing freely. By the time dessert arrived, Lord Thornwood was discussing the details of the alliance openly, as if Evelyn wasn't even there. The Thornwood forces would provide military support for Adrian's expansion into the northern territories. In exchange, Adrian would grant the Thornwoods exclusive trade rights across the empire's southern ports. And to seal the alliance, there was talk, carefully couched in diplomatic language, of a marriage arrangement. Evelyn watched Adrian's face, saw the satisfaction there, the triumph. He'd built this entire alliance on the foundation of her family's power, and now he was preparing to kick that foundation out from underneath her. She set down her wine glass with deliberate precision. The sound was soft, but everyone at the table noticed. Adrian finally looked at her. A marriage arrangement, she said. Her voice was perfectly calm. How fascinating. I don't recall discussing this in council. Adrian's smile was thin. You've been indisposed, my dear. Court business continues regardless. Of course. She returned his smile with one equally empty. Though traditionally matters of imperial succession are discussed with the Empress before being negotiated with foreign powers. The table went very quiet. Lord Thornwood cleared his throat uncomfortably. Your Majesty, I assure you, I'm sure you meant no disrespect, Lord Thornwood, Evelyn said smoothly. You were simply following the Emperor's lead. As we all do. She let that hang in the air for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for everyone to hear the blade hidden in the courtesy. Adrian's eyes hardened. Perhaps we should discuss this later. In private. Perhaps we should have discussed it earlier. In private. She stood, setting her napkin aside. If you'll excuse me, gentlemen. Lady Genevieve, I find I'm still not quite recovered from yesterday's indisposition. She left before anyone could respond. Heard the uncomfortable silence behind her. Heard Adrian make some smooth excuse about her health, her nerves, the strain of court life. Let him explain. Let him scramble to repair the perfect evening she'd just cracked. She walked back to her chambers feeling something unfamiliar burning in her chest. It wasn't quite satisfaction. Not yet. But it was close. Sarah was waiting in her sitting room when she arrived, looking nervous but determined. "Your Majesty, I delivered your letters. 4 of them have already responded." She handed Evelyn a small bundle of sealed messages. Evelyn took them, heart hammering, and broke the first seal. General Thorne would be honored to meet with her tomorrow afternoon. Private location. Maximum discretion. Lord Ashford had concerns about recent financial audits and would appreciate her counsel. Ambassador Chen suggested a conversation about trade negotiations that seemed to contradict the Emperor's stated policies. And Commander Reeves of the Western Garrison simply wrote, "It's about damn time." Evelyn read each response twice, memorizing the tone, the implications, the careful phrasing that meant "I'm listening without committing treason" on paper. 4 out of 5. Not bad for a first move. She burned the letters in her fireplace, watching the paper curl and blacken. Then she composed her responses, setting times and locations for meetings. Each one different, each one carefully chosen to avoid pattern or suspicion. By the time she finished, it was past midnight. The palace was quiet. Somewhere in his own chambers, Adrian was probably drinking with Lord Thornwood, celebrating his brilliance, planning Evelyn's elegant disappearance from his perfect empire. He had no idea the war had already started, and he definitely didn't know he was losing. Evelyn stood at her window, looking out over the capital city. Lights flickered in thousands of windows. People sleeping, people living their lives, completely unaware that their empire was built on lies and held together by corruption. Soon they'd know. Soon everyone would know. But first she needed to gather her army, build her evidence, wait for exactly the right moment to strike. She thought about the letters in that hidden chamber, about Adrian's plans to erase her, about 10 years of manufactured affection and calculated betrayal. And she realized something had changed in her during those hours locked in her chambers yesterday. The woman who'd loved Emperor Adrian Vale was dead. She'd died quietly, without ceremony, in a hidden room full of lies. What remained was something harder, colder, something that had stopped begging for love and started planning revenge. Queen Evelyn Lancaster looked at her reflection in the dark window and smiled. This was going to be the longest year of Adrian Vale's life, and she was going to enjoy every single moment of watching him realize exactly what he'd lost when he decided she was disposable. The game had changed, and this time she was playing to win. The morning after this disastrous dinner, Evelyn woke to find her chambers under surveillance. Not overtly. Adrian was too clever for that. But she recognized the signs. New guards posted at the end of her corridor, servants she didn't recognize lingering near her doors. The palace had eyes now, and all of them were pointed at her. She'd rattled him. Good. Marian brought breakfast on a silver tray, her hands trembling slightly as she set it down. "Your Majesty," she whispered, "the Emperor has requested your presence in his study at noon." Requested, as if he was asking politely instead of issuing a summons. "Tell him I'll be there," Evelyn said, her voice steady, even though her pulse was already accelerating. She recognized what was coming. Adrian was going to try to put her back in her box, remind her of her place, make her understand that queens who embarrassed their emperors paid for it. Let him try. She dressed carefully. Not Lancaster blue this time. That had made her point. Today she needed something different. She chose deep crimson with gold embroidery, veil colors, the perfect imperial consort. She piled her hair high, added the diamond necklace Adrian had given her on their 5th anniversary, applied cosmetics until her face looked like a porcelain mask. When she looked in the mirror, she saw exactly what Adrian wanted to see. The obedient wife, the decorative queen, the woman who knew her place. Underneath that mask, something else was calculating distances and counting exits. The walk to Adrian's study took her through the central palace. More eyes. More guards. Word had spread about last night. The servants whispered as she passed. The nobles she encountered in hallways studied her with new interest, trying to determine if she was finally breaking or if something more dangerous was happening. She kept her face neutral. Let them wonder. Adrian's study was in the North Tower, far from the public chambers where he held court. This was his private space, where real decisions got made and inconvenient people got reminded of consequences. Blackwood was already there when she arrived, standing beside Adrian's desk like a vulture perched on a corpse. "Evelyn," Adrian said without looking up from the papers he was reviewing, "come in. Close the door." She did. The sound of the lock clicking felt like a trap springing shut. "Sit down." "I'd prefer to stand." Adrian finally looked at her. His expression was carefully controlled, but she could see the anger underneath. The irritation of a man whose perfectly orchestrated evening had been disrupted by an asset that was supposed to stay silent. "Last night was unacceptable," he said flatly. "I'm sorry you feel that way. Don't play games with me. You embarrassed me in front of the Thornwood delegation. You questioned my authority at my own dinner table. I questioned a marriage arrangement I wasn't informed about. That's not the same thing." Adrian stood, moving around the desk with deliberate slowness. Evelyn held her ground even though every instinct screamed at her to step back. He stopped exactly 1 foot away, close enough that she could smell the wine from last night still on his breath. "You don't get informed about every decision," he said quietly. "You're the empress. You smile and look beautiful and represent the crown. I make the actual decisions. That's how this works. That's how it's always worked." "Is it?" His eyes narrowed. "What's gotten into you?" "Perhaps I'm tired of being treated like furniture." Blackwood shifted uncomfortably. "Your Majesty, if I may—" "You may not," Evelyn said without looking at him. "This conversation is between my husband and myself. Unless the Emperor needs his advisor to speak for him now." Adrian's hand moved so fast she almost didn't see it coming. He didn't hit her. He grabbed her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes, his fingers digging into her jaw hard enough to leave marks. "Careful," he whispered. "You're playing a very dangerous game. Am I? Or are you just realizing I stopped playing yours?" For exactly 3 seconds, neither of them moved. The study was so quiet, she could hear both of their hearts beating. His with rage, hers with something that felt disturbingly like exhilaration. Then Adrian released her, stepping back with visible effort to regain his composure. "You will apologize to Lord Thornwood," he said. "You will attend tonight's reception, and you will be gracious and charming and everything a proper empress should be. You will not question me again in front of foreign delegates. You will not undermine my negotiations. You will remember who gave you that crown you're wearing. You mean who bought it with my family's fortune." The words were out before she could stop them. Blackwood actually gasped. Adrian went completely still, and for a moment she thought he might actually strike her this time. Instead, he smiled. It was the most terrifying thing she'd ever seen. "Get out," he said softly. "Before I do something we'll both regret." Evelyn turned and walked to the door. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely turn the handle. But she kept her back straight, her steps measured, and she didn't look back until she was in the corridor with the door closed behind her. Then she leaned against the wall and fought to breathe normally. Her jaw ached where he'd grabbed her. She could feel the bruises already forming. Tomorrow she'd have to cover them with cosmetics. Tomorrow she'd have to pretend this hadn't happened. But today, right now, she'd just looked the Emperor in the eyes and told him the truth. And she was still standing. The meeting with General Thorne was scheduled for 3 that afternoon at a private residence inside the city. Evelyn couldn't leave the palace without Adrian knowing, so she did what any royal who'd survived court politics would do. She hid in plain sight. She announced she was visiting the city orphanage. Charitable work. Perfect imperial duty. Adrian couldn't object without looking callous, and it gave her the excuse to leave the palace with minimal escort. She took only Sarah and 2 guards who'd served the Lancaster family before they'd ever heard of Adrian Vale. The orphanage visit was brief. She donated money, smiled at children, said all the appropriate things. Then she slipped out a side entrance while Sarah created a distraction and walked 3 blocks to a house owned by a merchant who owed the Lancaster family favors stretching back decades. General Thorne was waiting in the drawing room. He stood when she entered, and the way he looked at her told her everything she needed to know. He'd already heard about last night's dinner. Probably half the Empire had heard by now. "Your Majesty," he said, "thank you for coming. Thank you for meeting with me, General. I know this is irregular." "Irregular. That's one word for it." He gestured to a chair. "Please sit. We don't have much time before people notice you're missing." She sat. Thorne remained standing, studying her with the assessing gaze of a man who'd spent 40 years evaluating threats and opportunities. "My wife told me about the winter ball," he said bluntly. "About the emperor and his girl. I assume that's why we're here." "Partially. What's the other part?" Evelyn reached into the small bag she'd brought and removed a folded document. One of the letters she'd found in the hidden chamber. Financial records showing how Adrian had redirected funds meant for the Eastern legions into his personal expansion projects. She handed it to Thorne. He read it slowly, his expression darkening with each line. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. "Does it matter?" "It matters if you're asking me to commit treason." "I'm not asking you to commit treason. I'm asking you if you serve the Empire or the Emperor, because those aren't the same thing anymore." Thorne set the document down carefully. "That's a dangerous distinction to make, Your Majesty." "Is it?" "My family built this empire. My fortune funded it. My political connections secured the alliances that turned a warrior prince into an emperor. And now he's systematically dismantling everything we created so he can replace it with something that serves only him." She leaned forward. "He's been stealing from the military, General. Your soldiers are going without supplies while he builds palaces for his mistress. Your officers are being replaced with his personal loyalists. How long before he decides the Eastern legions are a threat that needs to be neutralized?" Thorne's jaw tightened. "You have proof of this?" "I have more than proof. I have his entire network mapped out. Every illegal transaction, every forged signature, every person he's bribed or blackmailed into compliance." She held his gaze. "I know things that would destroy him. The question is whether you want to help me use them." "And what exactly do you want from me?" "Your loyalty. Your soldiers. Your willingness to stand with me when the time comes to expose what he's done." "You're talking about a coup. I'm talking about justice. There's a difference." Thorne walked to the window, looking out at the city. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with something that sounded like grief. "I served your father, Your Majesty. Before Adrian, before the Empire. I watched you grow up in the Lancaster court. I was there when you married him, and we all thought, it was a good match, a strong match." He paused. "I've watched him change over the years, watched him become something I don't recognize. But a soldier doesn't just turn on his emperor because he doesn't like the man anymore. Even when that emperor is planning to have his own wife killed." The silence that followed was absolute. Thorne turned slowly. "What?" Evelyn told him about the hidden chamber, about the letters, about Adrian's plan to arrange an accident once the Thornwood alliance made the Lancaster fortune obsolete. She spoke clinically, keeping her voice steady, presenting it like a military briefing instead of a death sentence. When she finished, Thorne looked like he'd aged 10 years. "God above," he whispered. "Does anyone else know about this?" "Not yet. But they will. Everyone will. I'm going to make sure of it." Thorne was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded once, sharp and military. "What do you need?" "Time. Discretion. And when the moment comes, I need you to choose the right side." He met her eyes. "The Lancaster side has always been the right side, Your Majesty. We just forgot that for a while." After Thorne left, Evelyn sat alone in the empty drawing room and let herself feel the weight of what she'd just done. She'd crossed a line, recruited a general to her cause, started building an actual opposition force inside Adrian's empire. There was no going back from this. Her hands were shaking again. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed slowly until the trembling stopped. This wasn't fear. It was adrenaline, the chemical reaction of a body preparing for war. Sarah appeared in the doorway. "Your Majesty, we need to return. You've been gone almost an hour." Evelyn stood, smoothing her dress. "How do I look?" "Like a queen," Sarah said quietly. "Good. Let's keep it that way." They returned to the palace through the same side streets they'd left by. The orphanage director was paid well enough to confirm that Her Majesty had spent the entire afternoon reading to children. The guards who'd stayed with the carriage saw nothing unusual. By the time they reached the palace gates, it was as if the meeting with Thorne had never happened. But Marian was waiting in her chambers with a worried expression and a message. "The Emperor requests your presence at tonight's reception," she said. "He was very insistent that I deliver this message personally." Of course he was. Adrian wanted to make sure she understood he was watching, that her brief freedom this afternoon hadn't gone unnoticed. "Tell him I'll be there," Evelyn said. And Marian, I need you to do something for me. Anything, Your Majesty. I need you to find out which servants are loyal to Blackwood, who reports to him, who watches me and tells him where I go. Marian's eyes widened. Your Majesty, that's essential. I need to know who I can trust in this palace. Marian was silent for a moment. Then she nodded. I'll make inquiries. Quietly. Thank you. After Marian left, Evelyn prepared for the reception with mechanical precision. Bath, hair, cosmetics thick enough to cover the bruises on her jaw. A dress in midnight blue that was neither Lancaster nor Vale, but something elegantly neutral. She looked in the mirror and saw a stranger. Someone harder than the woman who discovered those letters 3 days ago. Someone who'd learned to weaponize courtesy and hide daggers behind diplomatic smiles. The reception was in the grand ballroom, the same room where she'd discovered the hidden passage. The same room where her marriage had died while everyone else danced and drank and pretended everything was perfect. Adrian was already holding court when she arrived. Lord Thornwood, Genevieve, Isabel hovering nearby like she had every right to be there. The inner circle of people who represented Evelyn's replacement. She walked directly to Adrian's side, smiled, placed her hand on his arm with practiced affection. My apologies for being late, she said. I was visiting the city orphanage this afternoon and lost track of time. Adrian's smile didn't reach his eyes. How charitable of you, my dear. I do try to remember those less fortunate than ourselves. Lord Thornwood cleared his throat. Your Majesty, I wanted to say about last night. No apology necessary, Lord Thornwood. Evelyn's voice was warm. I'm afraid I wasn't feeling well. Sometimes stress affects me more than I'd like to admit. I hope I didn't give offense. Not at all, Your Majesty. Quite understandable. She could feel Adrian's arm tense under her hand. He'd wanted her to grovel. Instead, she'd handled it with grace, made herself look sympathetic instead of unstable, and completely undercut his narrative about her being difficult. Two could play the performance game. The reception dragged on. Music, dancing, endless conversations about nothing. Evelyn moved through it like she was underwater, present but distant, participating without actually engaging. She danced with Lord Thornwood, complimented Genevieve's dress, even managed to exchange pleasantries with Isabel, who looked uncomfortable and young and completely out of her depth. Poor girl. She had no idea she was just another disposable asset in Adrian's collection. Near midnight, Evelyn excused herself to use the powder room. The hallways were quieter here, away from the ballroom. She walked slowly, savoring the brief solitude, when she heard voices coming from one of the side chambers. Adrian's voice. And Blackwood. She stopped, pressing herself against the wall, listening. The situation with the Queen is becoming problematic, Blackwood was saying. She's not reacting the way we anticipated. She'll fall in line. She always does. I'm not so sure anymore. Lady Thorne mentioned the Queen was asking unusual questions at the winter ball, and today's absence from the palace. She visited an orphanage. Hardly suspicious. Blackwood's voice lowered. General Thorne sent a message this afternoon. He wants to meet with you about military funding, specifically about discrepancies in the Eastern Legion budgets. Evelyn's heart stopped. Adrian was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was ice. Did he say what brought this on? He didn't. But the timing is interesting, don't you think? The Queen embarrasses us at dinner, disappears from the palace the next day, and suddenly Thorne is asking questions about finances. You think she went to him? I think we should consider the possibility that your wife is more dangerous than we've been giving her credit for. Another silence. Evelyn could picture Adrian's face, the calculation, the rage, the dawning realization that maybe, just maybe, he'd underestimated her. Increase surveillance, Adrian said finally. I want to know everywhere she goes, everyone she talks to. If she's building something, I want to know about it before it becomes a problem. And if she is, then we move up the timeline. I don't care if the Thornwood alliance isn't finalized yet. We can't afford to wait if she's actively working against us. Understood. Their footsteps moved toward the door. Evelyn fled silently back toward the ballroom, her mind racing. They knew. They didn't have proof yet, but they suspected. And Adrian was willing to kill her sooner rather than later if she became too much of a threat. She needed to move faster, gather more allies, build her case until it was airtight and impossible to refute. And she needed to be more careful. Because the palace wasn't just watching her anymore. It was hunting her. She made it back to the ballroom seconds before Adrian and Blackwood emerged from the hallway, grabbed a glass of wine from a passing servant, took a long drink to steady her hands. When Adrian found her moments later, she was laughing at something Ambassador Chen was saying, looking perfectly relaxed and completely harmless. Adrian's eyes searched her face, looking for cracks, for signs that she knew what he was planning. She smiled at him, sweet, obedient, everything a perfect empress should be. And behind that smile, she was counting the days until she could watch him burn. The next morning, Lord Ashford came to her. Not to her chambers, that would be too obvious. Instead, he intercepted her during her morning walk through the palace gardens, where surveillance was difficult and conversations could be dismissed as casual encounters. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing. "Might I have a word?" "Of course, Lord Ashford." She gestured to a bench beneath a flowering tree. "Walk with me." They strolled slowly through the gardens, two people having an innocent conversation about weather and spring blooms and absolutely nothing important. "I received your letter," Ashford said quietly, "about the financial audits. And I've been noticing irregularities for months, years actually, but questioning the Emperor's spending tends to be bad for one's career advancement, or one's continued breathing." Ashford gave her a sharp look. "You're more cynical than I expected, Your Majesty. I'm more informed than you expected. There's a difference." They walked in silence for a moment. Then Ashford spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "How much do you know?" "Everything. Every stolen coin, every forged document, every lie he's told to cover his tracks. Can you prove it?" "I can prove enough to destroy him 10 times over. The question is whether anyone will have the courage to stand with me when I do." Ashford stopped walking, looked at her directly. "And what happens to those of us who stand with you if you fail? Then we all die together. Probably slowly." Adrian's very creative when it comes to making examples of people. Not exactly a compelling recruitment speech, Your Majesty. "I'm not here to inspire you, Lord Ashford. I'm here to give you a choice. You can keep serving a corrupt emperor who's bankrupting the empire, or you can help me expose him before there's nothing left to save." She held his gaze. "But make no mistake. This is a choice. Once you're in, there's no going back, no changing sides if things get difficult. You're either with me or you're against me, and I promise you don't want to be against me." Ashford was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "What do you need? Access to the Imperial Treasury records. The real ones. Not the sanitized versions Adrian presents to the Council. That's treason. So is embezzlement." She smiled thinly. "We're all committing crimes here, Lord Ashford. The question is whose crimes will ultimately be judged." He looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. "You've changed, Your Majesty." "No. I just stopped pretending to be what everyone wanted me to be." They parted ways shortly after, Ashford back toward the palace, Evelyn deeper into the gardens where she could breathe without feeling like walls were closing in. Two allies now. Thorne and Ashford. Two men with access to military power and financial records. Two pieces of the puzzle she needed to dismantle Adrian's empire. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. She needed the nobles, the court, the people who traded in gossip and influence, the ones who could destroy a reputation faster than any army could destroy a city. She needed Lady Thorne. That evening, she sent an invitation to tea. Innocent, casual. Just two noble women sharing pleasantries. Lady Thorne accepted immediately, which told Evelyn everything she needed to know. The woman was curious, and curious people could be useful. They met in Evelyn's private sitting room. Marian served tea and then disappeared, leaving them alone. "Thank you for coming," Evelyn said. "Thank you for the invitation, Your Majesty." Lady Thorne's eyes were sharp and assessing. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me after the winter ball." "Why wouldn't I?" "Because I was the one who told you about the Emperor and his girl. Some people don't appreciate messengers who bring bad news." "I'm not most people." Lady Thorne smiled slightly. "No, I'm beginning to realize that." Evelyn poured tea with steady hands. "I wanted to thank you, actually, for telling me the truth. Most people at court prefer comfortable lies. The truth is more interesting and more useful." Evelyn set down the teapot. "Tell me, Lady Thorne, What do you know about the Emperor's finances? The question hung in the air between them. Lady Thorne didn't react with shock or confusion. She simply took a sip of her tea and considered her answer. I know he spends money he doesn't have. I know the treasury's been depleting at an alarming rate. I know my husband has been complaining about military funding shortfalls for 2 years. She met Evelyn's eyes. And I know he's been using your family's credit to cover the gaps. Do you know why? Because he's an ambitious man who wants an empire bigger than he can afford. That's part of it. The other part is that he's been systematically transferring Lancaster assets into his own name, preparing to cut me out entirely once I'm no longer useful. Lady Thorne set down her teacup carefully. And when do you become no longer useful, Your Majesty? According to his letters, very soon. Right around the time he marries Genevieve Thornwood and has me killed in a convenient accident. The silence that followed was profound. Lady Thorne's face went very pale. You have proof of this? I have his correspondence, his financial records, his entire plan laid out in writing. She leaned forward. I'm going to destroy him, Lady Thorne. I'm going to expose every crime he's committed and watch him lose everything he stole. But I need help. I need people who understand how to work the court, how to plant rumors, how to turn public opinion, how to make sure that when I finally reveal the truth, everyone's already primed to believe it. Lady Thorne was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled, and it was the most dangerous smile Evelyn had ever seen. Your Majesty, she said quietly, I thought you'd never ask. Over the next 2 weeks, Evelyn built her network piece by careful piece. Lady Thorne recruited other nobles. Ashford provided access to financial documents that proved systematic fraud. Thorne began quietly talking to military commanders about concerns regarding supply chain corruption. And Evelyn gathered it all together like puzzle pieces, creating a picture so damning that even Adrian's most loyal supporters would have to acknowledge the truth. But Adrian wasn't idle either. The surveillance intensified. Guards followed her everywhere. Servants reported her movements. Even Marian started looking nervous, caught between loyalty to the Queen and fear of what the Emperor might do if she was caught helping. Evelyn adapted. She held her meetings in public places where surveillance was expected. She couched everything in plausible deniability. She made sure that if Adrian did move against her prematurely, she had insurance, documents sealed and hidden with trusted allies, set to be released if anything happened to her. It was exhausting, living every moment like she was being watched, because she was. One night, she woke to find Adrian standing in her chambers, not in the doorway, beside her bed, just standing there in the darkness, looking down at her. She didn't scream, didn't move, just looked up at him and waited. You're plotting something, he said quietly. I don't know what you mean. Don't lie to me, Evelyn. I can feel it. Something's changed. She sat up slowly, pulling the covers around herself. What's changed is that I stopped believing your lies. That's all. His hand shot out and grabbed her throat. Not squeezing, just holding, a reminder of how easily he could hurt her. I made you, he whispered. Everything you are, everything you have exists because I allowed it. Don't forget that. She looked him in the eyes and smiled. Actually, Adrian, you made yourself emperor using my family's fortune. Everything you are exists because I gave it to you. Don't you forget that. For a moment, she thought he really would kill her, right there, strangle her in her own bed and claim she'd died in her sleep. Then he released her and stepped back. You have 1 week, he said. 1 week to remember your place and stop whatever you're doing. After that, I stopped being patient. He left without another word. Evelyn sat in the darkness, rubbing her throat where his fingers had been, and knew she was out of time. Whatever she was going to do, she had to do it now, before Adrian made good on his threats, before she became just another inconvenient queen who'd mysteriously died in her sleep. She had 1 week. 1 week to finish gathering evidence, 1 week to secure her alliances, 1 week to prepare for the moment when she'd stand in front of the entire empire and expose the man who'd tried to erase her. And if she failed, if Adrian moved first, or her allies abandoned her, or the court decided loyalty to the emperor trumped everything else, then she'd die knowing she'd at least tried to fight back. But she wasn't planning to fail. She was planning to burn his entire empire to the ground and make him watch. The countdown had begun, and Queen Evelyn Lancaster was finally ready for war. The week passed like a blade sliding slowly toward flesh. Evelyn moved through the palace, knowing every second counted, every conversation mattered, every alliance had to hold. She'd spent 6 days fortifying her position, gathering final pieces of evidence, ensuring that when she struck, the blow would be fatal. On the seventh day, everything fell apart. It started with Marian. She came to Evelyn's chambers just after dawn, face pale and hands shaking. "Your Majesty," she whispered, closing the door behind her, "we have a problem." Evelyn was already dressed, already preparing for the day's final meetings. What kind of problem? Lord Ashford was arrested last night. The Emperor's guards took him from his home. They're saying he's been caught embezzling from the Imperial Treasury. The words hit like a physical blow. Evelyn sat down slowly, her mind racing through implications and consequences. Ashford was one of her key allies. He had access to financial records that proved Adrian's corruption. If he'd been arrested, if Adrian had gotten to him first... Does anyone know why now? Why last night? Marian's voice dropped even lower. There are rumors, people saying someone informed the Emperor about Lord Ashford's activities. Someone close to you. The room seemed to tilt. Evelyn gripped the armrests of her chair and forced herself to breathe normally. Who? No one knows for certain, but Your Majesty, they're saying it came from inside your network, someone you trusted. Betrayal tasted like copper and ash. Evelyn stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Think. Don't panic. Figure out who and why and how to contain this. Where's Ashford now? The North Tower, where they keep prisoners awaiting trial. Has he talked? Marian hesitated. That's the other problem, Your Majesty. He's already given a confession, signed and sealed, naming accomplices. Evelyn turned sharply. What accomplices? I don't know the full list, but, Your Majesty, your name was mentioned as someone who was aware of the embezzlement and did nothing to stop it. There it was, Adrian's countermove. Frame Ashford as the criminal, and Evelyn as either an accomplice or a negligent fool who'd let corruption happen under her nose. Either way, it destroyed her credibility, made everything she was planning look like desperate deflection from her own guilt. Brilliant. Vicious. Exactly the kind of move Adrian excelled at. Send word to General Thorne, Evelyn said quietly. Tell him we need to meet. Today. Immediately. Your Majesty, if there's an informant, then we'll find out who, but I need to know if my other allies are still standing or if they've all been compromised. Marian left quickly. Evelyn stood at the window watching the sun rise over the capital and tried to calculate how badly she'd been damaged. Ashford arrested. Her name implicated in his alleged crimes. One of her allies had betrayed her, but which one? And how much had they told Adrian? The knock on her door came 30 minutes later. Not Marian. Someone heavier, more aggressive. Your Majesty, a male voice called, the Emperor requests your immediate presence. Requests. That word again, as if she had any choice. She opened the door to find Blackwood himself standing there, flanked by 4 guards. His expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes gleamed with something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. Lord Blackwood, to what do I owe this honor? The Emperor wishes to discuss certain irregularities that have come to light. He thought you might be able to clarify some confusion. How considerate of him. She stepped into the corridor. Lead the way. They walked through the palace in silence. The guards surrounded her like she was a prisoner being escorted to execution. Maybe she was. Maybe Adrian had decided the week was up and he was done playing games. They took her to the throne room. Not Adrian's private study. The public space where official business was conducted, where judgments were rendered and sentences passed. Adrian sat on the throne wearing full imperial regalia, crown, robes, the scepter that symbolized absolute authority. This wasn't a private conversation between husband and wife. This was the Emperor preparing to pass judgment on a subject. The room wasn't empty either. At least 24 nobles and courtiers lined the walls. Witnesses, an audience. Adrian wasn't just going to destroy her, he was going to make sure everyone watched. Evelyn walked to the center of the room and stopped. She didn't bow, didn't lower her eyes, just stood there and waited for him to speak first. Adrian studied her for a long moment. Then he gestured to someone standing in the shadows near the throne. General Thorne stepped into the light. Evelyn's heart stopped. No, not Thorne. Anyone but Thorne. But the general's face told her everything she needed to know before he even spoke. He wouldn't meet her eyes. His jaw was tight with something that looked like shame or resignation, or maybe both. General Thorne has brought some disturbing information to my attention, Adrian said. Information about treasonous activities being planned within my own court. He paused for effect. Would you care to explain, my dear wife, why you've been meeting secretly with my military commanders? Why you've been requesting access to confidential financial records? Why you've been gathering information about imperial operations without my knowledge or consent? The trap snapped shut with perfect precision. Thorne hadn't just betrayed her. He'd given Adrian everything, every meeting, every conversation, every piece of evidence she'd been gathering. She should have seen this coming, should have realized that a career soldier would ultimately choose the safer path. The path that kept him alive and in power rather than risking everything on a queen's desperate gamble. Your Majesty, Evelyn said carefully, I was concerned about certain financial irregularities. You were plotting a coup. Adrian's voice was ice. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise. I was investigating corruption. You were conspiring with my advisors and military commanders to undermine my authority. That's treason, Evelyn, even for a queen. And stealing your wife's fortune? Forging her signature on legal documents? Planning her murder? What do we call those, Your Majesty? The room went silent. Someone gasped. Adrian's expression didn't change, but his knuckles went white on the scepter. Careful, he said softly. You're making very serious accusations. I have evidence, letters, financial records, your entire criminal enterprise documented in your own handwriting. Evidence you claim to have. Adrian smiled. Evidence no one has seen except you. Evidence that conveniently appeared just as you were caught conspiring against the throne. He leaned forward. Tell me, wife, should the court believe you have secret documents proving my guilt, or should they believe that a desperate woman will say anything to deflect from her own crimes? Evelyn's mind raced. The letters. She'd hidden them carefully, but where? Think, where would they be safe from her chambers? She'd locked them in her private desk. And Adrian had unlimited access to her chambers. He'd probably searched them the moment Thorne told him what was happening. The evidence she'd spent weeks gathering was gone, destroyed, or worse, altered to implicate her instead. She'd lost. In one move, Adrian had flipped the entire board, made himself the victim and her the villain, turned her allies into witnesses against her, and destroyed the only proof that could save her. Lord Blackwood stepped forward, holding a leather portfolio. Your Majesty, if I may, we did find documents in the Queen's possession, correspondence suggesting she was planning to seize control of the imperial treasury, plans to replace key military commanders with her own loyalists, even preliminary discussions about removing you from power. He opened the portfolio and began reading. Evelyn recognized the words. They were her letters, but they'd been edited, words changed, context removed, transformed from evidence of Adrian's guilt into proof of her treachery. It was masterful forgery. Adrian must have been planning this countermove from the moment he realized what she was doing. While she'd been building her case, he'd been building hers. Every piece of evidence she'd gathered, he'd copied and altered. Every alliance she'd formed, he'd infiltrated and turned. She'd been playing chess while he was playing three-dimensional warfare. The nobles around the room were whispering now, looking at her with suspicion and fear. The perfect empress had become the scheming traitor. The woman they'd respected was now the woman who'd tried to destroy their empire from within. Adrian stood, descending from the throne with measured steps. When he reached her, he stopped exactly 1 foot away, close enough that only she could see his expression. The cold triumph, the absolute victory. You should have stayed in your box, he whispered. You should have smiled and looked pretty and let me handle the real decisions. Now you've forced my hand. He raised his voice so the whole room could hear. Queen Evelyn Lancaster is hereby stripped of her title and authority. She will be confined to her chambers under guard, pending a full investigation into her treasonous activities. All assets bearing the Lancaster name are frozen effective immediately. Any person found to have aided or conspired with the former queen will face charges of treason. He paused, letting that sink in, making sure everyone understood the stakes. Take her away. The guards moved forward. Evelyn didn't resist as they grabbed her arms. What was the point? She'd lost. Everything she'd built had crumbled in a single morning because she'd trusted the wrong person and underestimated her enemy. As they dragged her from the throne room, she caught one last glimpse of Adrian's face. He was smiling. Not the public smile he wore for courtiers and diplomats. His real smile. The one that said he'd won and she'd lost, and there was nothing she could do about it. They locked her in her chambers with 2 guards posted outside. Took her keys. Searched the room for anything that could be used as a weapon or a means of communication. When they finally left, she was alone in a gilded cage with no way out and no one coming to save her. She sat on the edge of her bed and tried to process what had just happened, tried to figure out where the betrayal had started, when Thorne had decided to turn on her. Whether he'd been working for Adrian from the beginning, or if he'd simply chosen survival over loyalty when forced to make a choice. Did it matter? The result was the same. She was finished, powerless, waiting for Adrian to decide whether she'd be executed publicly or disappear quietly in a convenient accident. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky. No one came. No food, no water, no information, just silence and isolation and the growing certainty that she'd made a fatal miscalculation. She'd thought the truth would be enough, that evidence of Adrian's crimes would speak for itself, that people would choose justice over convenience once they saw how corrupt the empire had become. But truth didn't matter in a world built on power and fear. Evidence didn't matter when the emperor controlled who saw it and how it was interpreted. Justice didn't matter when survival depended on backing the winning side. She'd been naive, stupid, so focused on proving Adrian's guilt that she'd forgotten the first rule of imperial politics. The person who controls the narrative controls reality. Near sunset, the door opened. Marian entered carrying a tray of food, her face streaked with tears. "Your Majesty," she choked out. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I never thought—" "It's not your fault," Evelyn said quietly. She took the tray even though she wasn't hungry. "Do you know what's being said outside?" Marian nodded miserably. "They're calling you a traitor, saying you tried to steal the throne, that you were working with foreign powers to overthrow the emperor. The whole city believes it. Of course they did." Adrian had spent all day spreading his version of events. By now, the entire empire probably thought she was a villain who'd betrayed her husband and country out of greed or ambition or whatever motivation made the story most compelling. "Has anyone spoken in my defense?" Marian's silence was answer enough. "What about Lady Thorne?" "House arrest. Her husband testified against you, so the emperor's being merciful. She's confined to her estate but not charged with any crimes. So even the woman who'd helped recruit nobles to Evelyn's cause had been neutralized without being punished." Another brilliant move. Adrian was showing mercy to the families of those who'd betrayed the traitor queen, building loyalty through forgiveness instead of fear. He'd thought of everything. Marian set down a folded piece of paper on the tray. "This came for you from someone in the city. They paid a servant to smuggle it in." "Who?" "They wouldn't say. Just that it was urgent you receive it." After Marian left, Evelyn unfolded the paper with shaking hands. The handwriting was unfamiliar. The message was brief. "Not everyone believes the emperor's lies. Some of us remember who actually built this empire. If you survive the next 3 days, there may still be hope. Burn this." No signature. No indication of who'd sent it or what they wanted or whether they could actually help. Just a cryptic message from someone who either genuinely supported her or was setting up another trap. Evelyn held the paper over a candle flame and watched it curl and blacken. Hope was a dangerous thing in a situation like this. Hope made you stupid, made you vulnerable, made you believe rescue was coming when the only real option was accepting defeat. But some part of her, the part that had survived 10 years of Adrian's manipulation, couldn't quite let go of the possibility that this wasn't over yet. 3 days? The message said 3 days. What happened in 3 days? She spent that night staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out what move she still had left. The evidence was gone or corrupted. Her allies had turned or been silenced. Adrian controlled the narrative completely. Even if she screamed the truth from the rooftops, who would believe her? The answer came just before dawn. A sound in the hallway. Voices. Not the usual guards changing shifts. Something urgent. Something wrong. Her door burst open. Not guards this time. Adrian himself, still in nightclothes, face twisted with rage. "What did you do?" he snarled. Evelyn sat up slowly. "I don't understand. What did you do? He crossed the room in 3 strides and grabbed her by the throat, slamming her against the headboard. The entire eastern quarter is burning. Someone set fire to the military barracks, killed 6 guards, and freed Lord Ashford from the North Tower. So I'll ask you one more time. What did you do? Eveline clawed at his hands, gasping for air. Through the window behind Adrian's shoulder, she could see orange flames lighting up the pre-dawn sky. Smoke rising in thick columns, the sound of bells ringing emergency alerts throughout the city. She had no idea what was happening, but she understood instantly what it meant. Someone else was making moves. Someone powerful enough to attack military installations and break prisoners out of the Imperial Tower. Someone who was forcing Adrian to divide his attention between crushing her and dealing with an active insurgency. I didn't do anything, she choked out. I've been locked in here. You planned this. You and your conspirators. If I'd planned this, I wouldn't still be here. She met his eyes even as black spots danced in her vision. Think, Adrian. If I had allies powerful enough to burn your barracks and storm your prison, why would they leave me locked in a room waiting to die? Adrian's grip loosened slightly. She could see him calculating, running through scenarios, trying to figure out who was responsible and what they wanted. The door burst open again. Blackwood, dressed hastily, face pale. Your Majesty, we need to move you to a secure location. There are reports of armed groups in the streets. The city guard is overwhelmed. How many? At least 300. Maybe more. They're organized, well-armed. Someone's been planning this for weeks. Adrian released Eveline and turned to Blackwood. Gather the Imperial Guard. I want every man we have on the streets. Find whoever's responsible and bring them to me alive. And the Queen? Lock her in the North Tower, maximum security. If she escapes, you burn with her. They dragged Eveline from her chambers in chains. Real chains this time, iron biting into her wrists and ankles. Down through corridors filled with running soldiers and panicked servants. Out into the courtyard where smoke from the fires made breathing difficult, and ash fell like black snow. The city was in chaos. Flames, shouting, the clash of weapons echoing from multiple directions. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than a simple prison break. This was coordinated, professional. An actual military operation unfolding inside the capital itself. The North Tower was where they kept the most dangerous prisoners, traitors, assassins, people who'd tried to kill the Emperor or overthrow the Empire. The cells were stone and iron, designed to be inescapable. They threw Eveline into a cell on the 4th floor and locked the door with 3 separate mechanisms. She could hear fighting outside. Closer now. The insurgents, whoever they were, seemed to be moving toward the palace. Hours passed. The sounds of battle ebbed and flowed, sometimes close enough that she could hear individual voices shouting orders, sometimes distant enough that it might have been thunder. Then, near midday, her cell door opened. Commander Reeves stood there, the officer from the Western garrison who'd responded to her letter weeks ago with a simple message. It's about damn time. Your Majesty, he said, bowing slightly, we need to move. Now. Eveline stared at him. You're behind this? I'm one of several. He gestured urgently. I'll explain everything once we're somewhere safe, but right now, half the Imperial Guard is looking for us, and we have maybe 10 minutes before they breach this level. Where's Ashford? Already evacuated, along with anyone else the Emperor arrested in the past week. He smiled grimly. Turns out you weren't the only one gathering allies, Your Majesty. Some of us have been preparing for this moment for years. They ran through corridors thick with smoke, past dead guards and shattered doors. The tower was a war zone. Reeves had brought at least 50 soldiers, all wearing unmarked armor, all moving with military precision. They made it to the ground level and out into a side courtyard. Horses waited. Reeves lifted Eveline onto one and mounted behind her. Hold on, he said, and kicked the horse into a gallop. They rode through streets transformed into battlegrounds. Buildings burned, bodies lay in gutters. Citizens huddled in doorways, terrified and confused. The Empire's perfect capital was tearing itself apart. Where are we going? Eveline shouted over the chaos. Somewhere the Emperor can't reach you. Somewhere you can rebuild. They rode for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, finally reaching a warehouse district near the river. Reeves led them into a building that looked abandoned from the outside, but was clearly being used as a base of operations. Maps covered the walls. Weapons were stacked in corners. At least 100 people filled the space, all of them armed and organized. And in the center of it all, sitting at a rough wooden table covered in documents, was Lord Ashford. "Your Majesty," he said, standing as she entered, "welcome to the Resistance." Evelyn's legs gave out. Reeves caught her before she hit the floor, guiding her to a chair. She sat heavily, mind reeling, trying to process everything that had happened in the past 12 hours. "I don't understand," she said. "Thorne betrayed us. Adrian has evidence against me." "I lost." "You lost the first battle," Ashford corrected. "Not the war." He gestured around the room. "General Thorne's betrayal was unfortunate, but not unexpected. We've had contingency plans in place since the beginning. When Adrian moved against me, it triggered protocols we'd established months ago." "What protocols?" "Armed resistance. We have forces embedded throughout the military. Officers loyal to the old empire. Soldiers who remember when the throne stood for something other than one man's ambition." He leaned forward. "The moment Adrian arrested me, they began mobilizing. Today's operation was years in the making." Evelyn looked around the warehouse, at the maps showing troop positions and supply lines, at the people preparing weapons and coordinating movements. This wasn't a desperate last stand. This was an organized rebellion. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because we needed you to act naturally, to build your case and gather evidence exactly as you did, to draw Adrian's attention so he'd focus on stopping you instead of noticing what we were building in the shadows." Ashford's expression softened. "You were bait, Your Majesty. And you played your part perfectly." The words hit like a physical blow. Everything she'd done, every risk she'd taken, every alliance she'd built thinking she was leading the resistance, it had all been theater, a distraction to keep Adrian busy while the real opposition organized behind her back. She'd been used. By Adrian, by the resistance, by everyone who'd ever pretended to need her. "I should feel angry," she said quietly. "But I just feel tired." "You should feel victorious," Ashford said. "Adrian's been exposed. The city's seen his guards murder citizens in the streets while trying to crush dissent. Every brutal response to today's uprising has eroded his legitimacy. By this time tomorrow, half the empire will be questioning whether he deserves the throne, and the other half will call you traitors and hunt you down. Then we make sure our half wins." Reeves stepped forward. "Your Majesty, we need you to make a choice. Adrian's claiming you orchestrated today's violence, that you're a terrorist trying to destroy the empire. We can either accept that narrative and disappear into hiding, or we can stand and fight. Release the evidence you gathered. Tell the people the truth about what he's done. Make this a real war instead of a suppression operation." Evelyn looked at him. "I don't have the evidence anymore. Adrian destroyed it." Ashford smiled. "Did he?" He pulled out a familiar leather portfolio, the same one she'd used to store her original letters. "We made copies, Your Majesty, multiple copies, hidden in locations throughout the city. Adrian destroyed one set. We still have everything else." Hope and horror warred in Evelyn's chest. She had a choice. She could run, disappear, let the resistance fight their war without her, save herself from whatever bloody consequences were coming. Or she could stand and fight, transform from Adrian's disposable wife into a genuine threat to his power, risk everything on the possibility that truth and justice might actually matter if backed by sufficient force. It wasn't really a choice at all. She stood on shaking legs and looked around at the people filling the warehouse. Her people now. Whether she'd chosen them or they'd chosen her didn't matter anymore. "How many soldiers do we have?" "About 3,000 committed. Another 5,000 who will probably join once they see we're serious." Reeves met her eyes. "It's not enough to win a conventional war, but it's enough to make Adrian bleed. Then let's make him bleed." Because Queens didn't surrender, and Evelyn Lancaster had stopped being Adrian Vale's convenient asset the moment she'd decided survival required transformation into something harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous than anyone expected. The war was just beginning, and this time she wasn't playing by anyone's rules but her own. The war came faster than anyone expected. Within 48 hours of Evelyn's rescue, the empire had fractured into 3 distinct territories. Adrian controlled the capital and the central provinces. The resistance held the western territories and key river trade routes. And in between, a contested zone where neither side could claim victory, but both sides bled daily trying. Eveline stood in what had been a merchant's mansion and was now Resistance headquarters, studying maps that showed their impossible situation. 3,000 soldiers against Adrian's 20,000. Limited supplies. No formal treasury. Their only advantages were surprise, moral authority, and the fact that half of Adrian's forces didn't really want to kill their own countrymen. Not enough. Not nearly enough. Commander Reeves entered without knocking. Your Majesty, we've received word from the northern garrisons. 4 commanders are willing to defect if we can guarantee their families' safety. Can we? Not yet. We barely have enough food for our own people. Then we can't make promises we can't keep. Tell them we're working on evacuation protocols. Buy time until we figure out logistics. Reeves nodded and left. Ashford replaced him moments later, looking exhausted. The Eastern supply convoy was ambushed. We lost half the weapons shipment. Eveline closed her eyes briefly. How many casualties? 12 dead. 20 wounded. 12 more names added to the list of people who died because she'd chosen war over surrender. 12 more reasons she couldn't afford to lose. There was a strange clarity that came with having nothing left to lose. When Adrian had stripped her of title and dignity, when he'd thrown her in chains and tried to paint her as a traitor, he'd inadvertently freed her from the last constraints of propriety and political calculation. She wasn't playing by imperial rules anymore. She was fighting like someone who understood that survival required transformation into something harder than anyone expected. The door burst open again. Lady Thorne this time, having escaped house arrest 3 days ago and joined the resistance with information about noble families ready to support a regime change. Your Majesty, she said breathlessly, you need to see this. She handed Eveline a printed broadsheet. One of the propaganda leaflets Adrian's people had been distributing throughout the city. This one showed a crude illustration of Eveline depicted as a monster destroying buildings while innocent citizens fled in terror. The headline read, "The Traitor Queen's War Against Her Own People." They're distributing thousands of these, Lady Thorne said, blaming every death, every fire, every bit of suffering on you personally. Eveline studied the image, saw how Adrian had twisted the narrative, made her the aggressor and himself the defender. It was brilliant propaganda, simple enough that anyone could understand it, emotional enough that it bypassed rational thought and went straight to fear. We need to counter this, Ashford said. Release our evidence. Show people what he's actually done. Eveline shook her head slowly. Evidence doesn't matter to someone who's convinced we're monsters. We show them documents about financial fraud, they'll say we forged them. We show them letters proving his crimes, they'll say we manipulated the text. She set down the broadsheet. We can't win a propaganda war when he controls the printing presses and the distribution networks. Then what do? We stop trying to convince them and start showing them. She turned to face the room full of resistance leaders. Adrian's been painting us as terrorists. Fine. Let's show the people what we're actually fighting for. Open the Western territories to refugees from the contested zones. Distribute food to civilians regardless of their political loyalty. Protect villages whether they support us or not. Make it impossible for them to believe we're the monsters he claims we are. That'll drain our resources even faster, Reeves warned. Then we'll starve together. Better that than become what he's accusing us of being. The conversation was interrupted by an explosion that shook the building. Everyone rushed to the windows. Smoke rose from the Eastern District. Adrian's artillery. They'd been shelling resistance-held neighborhoods for days, trying to force surrender through attrition and terror. Eveline watched the smoke rise and felt something cold settle in her chest. This was what war actually looked like when you stopped pretending it was glorious. Civilians dying, buildings burning, children orphaned because their parents chose the wrong side or lived in the wrong district, or simply had the misfortune of existing in a contested space. And she was responsible. Not solely, not entirely, but responsible nonetheless. Every person who joined the resistance because they believed in her, every soldier who'd defected because she'd asked them to, every civilian who died in crossfire because her choices had split the empire in half. The weight of that responsibility felt like drowning. Your Majesty, Lady Thorne said quietly, we received a message. From the palace. Eveline turned. What kind of message? A meeting request. From the Emperor himself. He wants to negotiate. The room went silent, everyone staring at her. waiting to see how she'd respond to the man who'd tried to erase her reaching out now that erasing wasn't working. Where and when? Neutral ground, the old council chambers in the city center, 3 days from now. Both sides can bring 5 advisors. No weapons. It's a trap, Reeves said immediately. Probably, Evelyn agreed. But we're losing this war. Slowly but certainly. We can't match his numbers or resources. If there's even a chance of ending this without more bloodshed, he'll never surrender, Ashford interrupted. This is about buying time, dividing our leadership, making us look weak. Evelyn met his eyes. Then I'll make sure we look strong. Tell the Emperor I accept his invitation. 3 days. Old council chambers. I'll bring 4 advisors. Who's the 5th? Me. I'm not just sending representatives. I'm going myself. The room erupted, everyone talking at once, telling her it was suicide, that Adrian would have her killed the moment she entered the building, that a leader who put herself in enemy hands was a leader who'd abandoned her people. She let them argue for exactly 30 seconds. Then she slammed her hand on the table hard enough that Maps jumped. Enough! Her voice cut through the noise like a blade. I'm going. Not because I trust him, not because I think he's negotiating in good faith. I'm going because our soldiers are dying and our supplies are running out, and if there's even a microscopic chance of ending this without complete annihilation, I have to take it. She looked around at each of them. You followed me into this war. Trust me to know when fighting might not be the only option left. The silence that followed was heavy with doubt and fear and reluctant acceptance. If you die, Reeves said quietly, this whole thing falls apart. Then make sure you have contingency plans. She turned back to the maps. And start preparing for the possibility that I don't come back at all. The next 3 days moved like water through a broken dam. Evelyn prepared for the meeting while simultaneously preparing for her death. She wrote letters to key resistance leaders outlining succession plans. Organized supply chains that didn't depend on her direct oversight, made sure that if Adrian did kill her, the movement would survive long enough to matter. She also planned for the meeting itself. What she'd say, what she'd offer, what lines she absolutely couldn't cross. Ashford helped her rehearse negotiations while Lady Thorne advised on reading Adrian's body language and verbal tells. Reeves drilled her on defensive tactics and escape routes, but none of it changed the fundamental reality. She was walking into enemy territory with minimal protection to face a man who'd already tried to kill her once and would certainly try again if given the opportunity. The night before the meeting, she couldn't sleep, lay in a borrowed bed in a borrowed house thinking about the past weeks, the speed with which everything had transformed. A month ago, she'd been a decorative queen in a gilded cage. Now she was a military commander leading an insurgency. The change had happened so fast she sometimes didn't recognize herself. There was something both terrifying and exhilarating about that transformation, about discovering she had the capacity for this kind of ruthlessness, this kind of cold calculation. She'd always known she was smart, strategic, good at political maneuvering, but she'd never known she could look at casualty reports and make decisions that would create more casualties because the alternative was surrender. That's what leadership actually required when stripped of all the courtly pretense. The willingness to sacrifice pieces on a board where every piece was a human life. The ability to carry the weight of those deaths without collapsing. The strength to keep moving forward even when every instinct screamed to stop and grieve and acknowledge the horror of what you'd become. She wondered if Adrian felt this way, if he lay awake at night counting the cost of his ambitions, or if he'd lost that capacity somewhere along the way, traded conscience for power until he couldn't remember what it felt like to care about anything beyond winning. Maybe she was becoming that too. Maybe that was the price of survival in a world built on violence and betrayal. Morning came too fast. Evelyn dressed in Lancaster blue, not armor, not royal regalia, just a simple dress in her family colors. A reminder to Adrian and everyone else that she'd existed before his empire, that she'd continue existing after. Her advisors assembled in the main hall. Reeves, Ashford, Lady Thorne, and surprisingly, Commander Hayes from the Northern Garrison, who'd defected 2 days ago with 300 soldiers and vital intelligence about Adrian's supply lines. Ready? Reeves asked. As I'll ever be. They rode through streets that still bore scars from recent fighting, buildings with walls blown open, debris cleared to the sides but not removed, citizens watching from windows, wary and exhausted. The war had aged the city decades in weeks. The old council chambers sat in the heart of the city, neutral ground because neither side fully controlled it. The building itself was ancient stone, predating the empire, built when this region was still a collection of independent territories negotiating trade and territory disputes. Adrian's forces surrounded the building, not overtly threatening, but absolutely present. A reminder that he controlled the capital even if he couldn't control the war. Eveline dismounted and walked toward the entrance with measured steps. Every eye on her, every soldier calculating whether she'd make it inside or if someone would break protocol and end this the fast way. She made it to the door, through the entrance hall, into the council chamber itself. Adrian sat at the head of a long table, Blackwood beside him. 3 generals she recognized and 2 nobles she didn't, all of them watching her with expressions ranging from hatred to curiosity to something that might have been respect. She took her seat at the opposite end of the table. Her advisors flanked her. The distance between her and Adrian was maybe 20 feet. Might as well have been a continent. "Eveline," Adrian said. His voice was carefully neutral. "Thank you for coming." "Your Majesty," she corrected coldly. "I may be leading a rebellion, but I'm still Lancaster-born. You don't get to use my name like we're friends." His jaw tightened. "Very well. Your Majesty, I called this meeting because what's happening is unsustainable. The Empire is tearing itself apart because you chose personal power over the realm's stability, because you chose rebellion over your duty as Empress. I chose survival over convenient murder. There's a difference." Blackwood leaned forward. "Your Majesty, perhaps we could focus on solutions rather than assigning blame. I didn't ride into enemy territory to be lectured by the man who helped my husband forge my signature on legal documents," Eveline said flatly. "If we're negotiating, I want terms, not platitudes." Adrian's expression was unreadable. "Terms. Fine. You surrender. Disband your forces. Accept exile outside the Empire. In exchange, I grant amnesty to everyone who followed you. No executions. No imprisonments. They return to their homes and lives. And me? You leave. Tonight. Never return. Never interfere in imperial affairs again." Eveline laughed. It was a harsh sound, devoid of humor. "You expect me to believe you'd actually honor that agreement? That you wouldn't have me killed the moment I crossed the border? I'm offering you your life. You're offering me a prettier execution. Exile where you control the circumstances, where no one can prove you arranged my death because it happened outside your jurisdiction." Adrian stood abruptly. "What do you want, Eveline? You've already cost me thousands of soldiers, destroyed trade routes, turned half the Empire against me. What more can you possibly take?" She stood as well, meeting his fury with cold precision. "I want you to abdicate. Transfer power to a council of nobles and military commanders. Accept responsibility for your crimes. Allow independent investigation into your financial corruption. And then you can have your exile. Your life. Your mistress. Everything except the throne you stole using my family's legacy." The silence that followed was absolute. Blackwood looked horrified. The generals shifted uncomfortably. Lady Thorne smiled slightly. Adrian's face went through several emotions in quick succession: shock, rage, something that might have been grudging admiration, then back to rage. "You're insane," he said quietly. "I'm realistic. You can't win this war." "Not really. You can kill us all, but you'll spend the rest of your reign fighting insurgencies and rebellions. You'll never be secure, never be safe, always wondering which general or noble or servant is planning the next attempt on your life." She leaned forward. "I'm offering you a way out. Retire gracefully. Live quietly. Let the Empire rebuild under people who actually care about something beyond personal power. Never. Then we keep bleeding. Your people and mine. Until there's nothing left of the Empire either of us wanted to rule." Adrian walked around the table slowly. His guards tensed, but he waved them back. He stopped directly in front of Eveline, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. The sleepless nights. The weight of decisions that had broken something fundamental inside him. "I loved you once," he said softly. "Did you know that? In the beginning, before everything got complicated. I actually loved you." "No, you didn't. You loved what I represented, the fortune, the connections, the legitimacy. You never loved me." His hand moved so fast she barely registered it. He grabbed her wrist, pulling her close enough that only she could hear his next words. I could kill you right now, snap your neck before your guards could draw breath to scream. But you won't. Because you need this war to end as much as I do. Because you're bleeding resources and loyalty, and the longer this goes on, the harder it becomes to maintain control. His grip tightened until bones ground together. When this is over, when you're dead and forgotten, I'll make sure history remembers you as the traitor who nearly destroyed everything your family built. And when you're gone, history will remember you as the thief who stole an empire and lost it through greed and stupidity. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away, just held his gaze and let him see that she wasn't afraid anymore. Fear required having something left to lose. Adrian released her abruptly, pushed her back toward her side of the table. This meeting is over. You have 1 week to surrender. After that, I stop holding back. I burn every Western village to the ground. I execute every prisoner. I make your rebellion so costly in civilian lives that your own soldiers will hand you over just to make it stop. Then you'll prove everything I've been saying about you, that you're not an emperor. You're a tyrant willing to murder his own people to maintain power. And you're a traitor, willing to sacrifice those same people rather than accept defeat. They stared at each other across the table. Two people who'd once shared a bed and a crown, who'd built an empire together even if the foundation was rotten, who now stood on opposite sides of a war neither could afford to lose. Evelyn gathered her advisors with a gesture. We're leaving. Adrian's voice stopped her at the door. Evelyn, one more thing. She turned. What? I really will kill you if you don't surrender. This isn't posturing. This isn't negotiation. If you're still standing against me in a week, I will personally ensure you die in the most public and humiliating way possible. She smiled. It was the coldest expression she'd ever worn. I know. That's why I'm not planning to surrender. They left the council chambers with Adrian's threats echoing behind them, made it to the horses, through the checkpoints, back into resistance territory without incident. The moment they were behind their own lines, Evelyn's composure cracked. She dismounted and vomited behind a building while her advisors pretended not to notice. The adrenaline was leaving her system, replaced by shaking hands and the metallic taste of fear she'd been suppressing for hours. Reeves appeared beside her, offered water. That went well, he said dryly. He rejected every term. Did you expect anything different? Evelyn took a drink, rinsed her mouth, spat. No, but I had to try. For the people who think we're not pursuing every possible peaceful solution. And now? Now, we prepare for the worst. She straightened, wiping her mouth. He gave us a week. That means he needs a week to position his forces for whatever he's planning. So we have 7 days to prepare our own response. They returned to headquarters where the senior commanders were already assembled. Evelyn didn't waste time with preamble. Adrian's planning a final offensive, maximum force, no restraint. He's going to try to end this in a single overwhelming attack. Where? Ashford asked. Here, the Western Territories. He'll hit our supply lines first, then our population centers. Force us to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. How do you know? Because that's what I'd do if I were him, and because he told me basically exactly that while threatening to burn villages. Can we hold? The question hung in the air, everyone looking at her, waiting for the queen who'd led them into this war to tell them they could actually win it. Evelyn looked at the maps, at the reports, at the numbers that didn't lie. 3,000 soldiers against 20,000, limited ammunition, dwindling supplies, civilian populations caught in the crossfire. No, she said quietly. We can't hold. Not indefinitely. Not against the full weight of the imperial military operating without restraint. Then what's the plan? Reeves demanded. We didn't follow you this far just to roll over and die. We don't hold. She traced a line on the map with one finger. We force him to come to us on ground of our choosing. Consolidate our forces here, at the old fortress outside the western capital. Make him commit his army to a siege position. And while he's focused on breaking our defenses, we strike at the capital, Ashford finished. Understanding dawning. You want to abandon the territories and attack the heart of his power. I want to make him choose between crushing the rebellion and protecting his throne. She looked around at each of them. It's a gamble, a huge one. We'll be leaving civilians exposed, sacrificing territory, betting everything on a single strike against the capital while he's diverted. And if it fails? Lady Thorne asked. Then we all die, and history forgets we ever tried to stop him. She held Lady Thorne's gaze. But if it succeeds, if we can take the capital and hold it long enough to prove Adrian's lost control, the rest of the empire will fracture. His allies will abandon him. His soldiers will question orders. We won't need to win every battle, just the one that matters most. Reeves was studying the map, calculating logistics. We'd need to move our entire civilian population behind fortress walls. Evacuate the Western territories. That's tens of thousands of people. Then we start evacuating tonight. Every cart, every horse, every person who can walk. Anyone who can't, we carry. The shelling will intensify once he realizes what we're doing, one of the commanders warned. I know. So we move fast and we move quietly, and we accept that not everyone will make it. The weight of that statement settled over the room like ash. Not everyone will make it. A clinical way of saying some of the people who'd trusted her were going to die during the evacuation, and she was making the decision to accept that cost. This is what power actually looked like when stripped of ceremony and pretense. The ability to make choices that killed people. The willingness to calculate acceptable losses. The strength to carry the weight of those deaths and keep moving forward because the alternative was surrender. And surrender meant everyone died instead of just some. Your Majesty, Ashford said carefully. This plan, it's essentially sacrificing our current position to strike at his center of power. There's no guarantee we can actually take the capital even if we make it there. I know. And if we can't, we'll have abandoned defensible territory for nothing. I know that too. She straightened her shoulders. But defensive positions don't win wars. They just delay defeat. Adrian has more soldiers, more resources, more time. The longer this drags on, the worse our position becomes. Our only chance is doing something he doesn't expect. Something so audacious he won't believe we're actually attempting it until it's too late to stop. How do we even get an army to the capital without him noticing? Lady Thorne asked. Every road is monitored. We don't take roads. We use the river. Move at night. Small boats. 20 soldiers per vessel. Stage them outside the city in abandoned warehouses. Wait until he commits his forces to the western siege. Then strike from within. You're talking about an amphibious assault on the most heavily defended city in the empire, Reeves said. That's not audacious. That's suicide. The difference between audacity and suicide is whether you succeed. She met each of their eyes in turn. I won't order anyone to follow this plan. If you think it's too risky, tell me now. I'll find another way. Silence. Long enough that she thought maybe this was where they'd finally break, where the reality of what she was asking would overcome loyalty and determination. Then Reeves spoke. I've been a soldier for 23 years, fought in 6 major campaigns, and this is hands down the craziest thing anyone's ever suggested. He paused. I'm in. Ashford nodded. The Treasury's already bankrupt. Might as well gamble what's left on a winning hand instead of slowly bleeding out. I'm in. Lady Thorne smiled. My husband betrayed us to save his career. I'd very much like to see the look on his face when we take the capital. I'm in. One by one, the commanders agreed, some enthusiastically, some reluctantly, but all of them committed. Eveline felt something shift in her chest. Not quite hope, but something adjacent. The realization that she'd built something real, a force united not by fear or greed, but by genuine belief that what they were fighting for mattered more than personal survival. Then we moved tonight. Evacuate civilians to the fortress. Begin staging assault forces along the river. Coordinate with any remaining allies inside the capital for intelligence and potential internal support. She paused. And prepare messages to our soldiers. Make sure they understand what we're attempting and why. Make sure they know that if this fails, it's on me, not them. The room emptied quickly as commanders rushed to implement the plan. Within hours, the evacuation began. Families loading possessions onto carts, children crying, old people being carried by younger relatives. The entire Western Territory transforming into a river of refugees flowing toward the fortress. Eveline stood on a rooftop and watched it happen. Watched thousands of lives disrupted because of choices she'd made. Decisions that had seemed righteous when made in the abstract, but looked brutal when translated into exhausted faces and abandoned homes. Your Majesty. She turned. Marian stood there, the servant who'd helped her survive the palace, who'd smuggled messages and provided intelligence and risked execution to support a queen who'd already been stripped of power. Marion, you should be with the evacuation convoy. I wanted to speak with you first. She moved closer, voice dropping. I've been thinking about what happens if you succeed, if you actually take the capital and remove the emperor. What about it? Who rules? You've spent weeks insisting this isn't about replacing one tyrant with another, that you want reform and justice. But when the dust settles, someone has to sit on that throne. Someone has to make decisions. Someone has to wield power. Eveline was quiet for a long moment. I don't want the throne, she said finally. I never wanted it. I wanted partnership, equality, a marriage that meant something beyond transaction. But you'll take it if you have to. If the alternative is chaos or Adrian's return, yes, I'll take it. And I'll try to be better than he was. Try to remember that every decision affects real people with real lives. She looked at Marion directly. But I won't pretend I'll be perfect. Power changes people, even people with good intentions. Marion smiled sadly. At least you're honest about it. That's more than most rulers manage. After Marion left, Eveline remained on the rooftop. The sun was setting. Smoke rose from various districts. The city that had once represented the empire's glory was scarred and broken and still somehow beautiful in the dying light. 7 days until Adrian's offensive. 7 days to evacuate tens of thousands of people. 7 days to stage an impossible assault on the capital. 7 days to either change history or become a footnote about a failed rebellion. Eveline took a deep breath and headed back inside. There was work to do, plans to finalize, messages to send, a war to prepare for. And somewhere in the capital, Adrian was preparing his own offensive, gathering his forces, calculating how to crush the resistance once and for all. Neither of them knew yet who would win, but both of them knew that when they met again, it wouldn't be across a negotiation table. It would be on a battlefield, and only one of them would walk away. The boats moved through darkness like ghosts on black water, 20 soldiers per vessel, 50 vessels in total. 1,000 men and women floating silently toward the capital, while Adrian's main force hammered against the fortress walls 200 miles west. Eveline crouched in the lead boat, watching the city's lights grow closer. Her hands were steady now. The shaking had stopped somewhere during the 3-day river journey, replaced by a cold clarity that felt almost like peace. This was it, the final move. Win or lose, everything would be decided in the next 12 hours. Reeves sat beside her, checking weapons for the 3rd time. You know this is insane, he whispered. You've mentioned that. Several times. Just making sure you're aware. She smiled slightly. Too late to turn back now. The boats reached the dock district near dawn. Abandoned warehouses lined the waterfront, places where resistance sympathizers had been staging supplies for weeks. They disembarked in silence, moving through pre-scouted routes toward their objectives. The palace, the Imperial Guard barracks, the communications center, the treasury. Hit them simultaneously, create chaos, force Adrian's remaining forces to fragment their response. Eveline's group moved toward the palace through service tunnels that predated the empire itself. Ancient maintenance passages that most people had forgotten existed. She'd learned about them years ago during renovation planning, had memorized the maps without knowing she'd ever need them. Funny how preparation for one life could become survival tools for another. They emerged inside the palace walls just as dawn broke. Guards were present, but not expecting an attack from within. The capital was supposed to be secure. The threat was 200 miles away, besieging the fortress. The fighting started fast and brutal. Her soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, taking control of key positions, securing escape routes, creating defensive perimeters. Within 30 minutes, they'd seized the eastern wing and were pushing toward the throne room. Alarms rang throughout the palace. Eveline could hear shouting, running footsteps, the clash of steel. Her heart hammered, but her mind stayed clear. This was what she'd trained for, what she'd been preparing for since that night she'd found Adrian's letters. They fought through corridors she'd walked 1,000 times as Empress, past rooms where she'd hosted diplomatic dinners and negotiated treaties. Every corner held memories of the life she'd lost. The woman she'd been before betrayal had transformed her into someone capable of leading an armed assault on her own former home. The throne room doors were defended by Adrian's personal guard, elite soldiers, well-trained, loyal to the death. The battle there was vicious. Eveline stayed back while her soldiers engaged. She wasn't a fighter. wasn't trained for direct combat. Her role was strategic, but she couldn't look away from the violence happening because of her orders. Men dying on marble floors, blood pooling in spaces designed for ceremony and pageantry. This was the cost. The real cost that didn't show up on casualty reports or strategic analyses. Human lives ending because she'd chosen war over surrender. They broke through. The throne room was empty. Adrian wasn't here. Of course he wasn't. He was at the front, leading his forces against the fortress, which meant, "Your Majesty." Ashford burst into the throne room, breathing hard. "We've taken the Treasury and Communications Center, but Adrian's generals are rallying troops from the outer districts. We have maybe an hour before they mount a coordinated counterattack. Then we hold for an hour." "Where's Lady Thorne?" "Already working the nobles, sending messages to every house that's been quietly supporting us, telling them the capital has fallen and it's time to choose sides publicly." Eveline moved to the throne, didn't sit on it, just stood beside it, looking at the symbol of power that had consumed so many lives. "Send word to the fortress. Tell them the capital is ours. Tell them to broadcast it on every frequency. Make sure Adrian hears that while he's breaking his army against our walls, we've taken his throne." "It'll enrage him," Reeves warned. "He'll turn his full force back toward the capital." "Good. That's exactly what we want. His army marching back here exhausted and demoralized while we're dug into defensive positions with fresh troops and civilian support. If this works," Ashford said slowly, "if we actually hold the capital and Adrian's forces fracture when they realize the throne's been taken, this could actually end the war. Or start a longer one. Civil wars don't always end cleanly just because someone takes a symbolic position, but it shifts everything, changes the narrative. You stop being the rebel and become the defender. Adrian stops being the emperor and becomes the usurper trying to reclaim what he lost." Eveline nodded. "That's the gamble. That taking this room matters more than holding territory. That symbols have power even in a world supposedly built on force and pragmatism. The hour passed in controlled chaos. Soldiers fortifying positions, messengers running between occupied buildings, Lady Thorne working her network of noble contacts, and Eveline standing in the throne room, watching the sun rise over a capital that might be hers or might be her tomb. Reports came in pieces. Adrian's generals had received word. The army was fracturing, some units refusing to abandon the siege, others turning back toward the capital. Confusion and contradictory orders spreading through the ranks. Then word came that Adrian himself was riding hard for the capital with his personal guard, leaving Blackwood to coordinate the siege, coming to face the woman who'd taken his throne while he was trying to crush her rebellion. He'd be here by nightfall, maybe sooner. Eveline sent most of the civilians out of the palace, kept only essential personnel and soldiers. If this turned into a siege, she didn't want non-combatants caught in crossfire. Lady Thorne argued, but eventually left to coordinate noble support from a safer distance. The day crawled toward evening. Defensive positions were solid, but not impregnable. Adrian would have numbers. They had position and moral authority. Whether that would be enough depended on variables no one could predict. Near sunset, a messenger arrived from Adrian under flag of truce, a letter sealed with the imperial crest. Eveline opened it alone in what had once been her private study. The handwriting was Adrian's, sharp, aggressive. Every letter formed with barely controlled fury. The message was brief. "You want the throne? You can have it. Come to the palace gardens at dusk, alone. We settle this between us. No armies, no politics. Just you and me and the wreckage of everything we built together." It wasn't signed. Didn't need to be. Eveline read it 3 times, trying to identify the trap. Because there had to be a trap. Adrian didn't make genuine offers. Everything was calculation. But she couldn't see the angle, couldn't figure out what he gained by meeting her alone. Unless he was as exhausted as she was, as tired of the bloodshed and strategy and endless maneuvering. Unless some part of him wanted this to end the way it had started, with just the 2 of them, before armies and empires had complicated everything. She found Reeves coordinating defenses in the East Wing. "I'm going to meet him." "Absolutely not. It's obviously a trap." "Probably. But if there's any chance of ending this without more deaths, your death ends it just as permanently, and guarantees everything we've fought for collapses." Or guarantees that I'm not building my empire on the same foundation of cowardice he used. She met his eyes. I'm not ordering you to like this decision. I'm informing you that I'm making it. Then I'm coming with you. No. You're staying here and holding this position. If I don't come back, you're in command. The succession plan is in my desk. Follow it. Your Majesty. That's an order, Commander. She left before he could argue further, changed from combat gear into something simpler, the Lancaster blue dress she'd worn to the first failed negotiation. A reminder of who she'd been, who she still was underneath all the violence and strategy. The palace gardens were where she'd spent quiet mornings during her marriage, before everything had fallen apart, before she'd discovered the letters. They'd been beautiful once, carefully maintained, a peaceful space in the heart of imperial power. Now they were overgrown and neglected. War had reached even here. Some of the decorative structures were damaged. The carefully planned paths were cracked and weed-choked. Adrian stood in the center near the fountain that no longer ran. He'd removed his armor, wore simple clothes like hers, just a man instead of an emperor. He looked older, exhausted, like the war had aged him years and weeks. She approached slowly, watching for soldiers hidden in the shadows, for the trap to spring. But the gardens appeared genuinely empty. They stood 10 feet apart. Two people who'd once shared everything, who'd built an empire together even if the foundation was rotten, who now stood on opposite sides of a divide that had consumed thousands of lives. Adrian spoke first. His voice was tired, empty of the rage she'd expected. I used to love these gardens, used to come here when politics got too heavy, when I needed space to think. I know, I saw you here sometimes, early mornings before the court woke up. Did you? I never noticed. You never noticed a lot of things about me. That was part of the problem. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fountain, the overgrown plants, the decay that had crept in while they'd been too busy destroying each other to maintain what they'd built. I didn't bring you here to kill you, he said finally, though that would solve a lot of problems. Then why? Because I'm tired, Eveline. Tired of fighting, tired of calculating every move, tired of being the villain in a story I thought was supposed to be about glory and legacy. He looked at her directly. I thought I was building something that would last, something that mattered. Instead, I built a machine that ate everything I cared about and still demanded more. You built it on lies and theft, on my family's fortune and forged signatures and planned murder. You don't get to claim exhaustion as if you're the victim here. I know. His voice was flat. I know exactly what I did. Every crime, every betrayal, every moment I chose power over principle. I've spent the past weeks reviewing all of it, trying to remember when I stopped being someone who wanted to make the world better and became someone who just wanted to win regardless of cost. And what did you conclude? That I can't remember. That the transformation happened so gradually I didn't notice until I was standing in a palace built on bodies and calling it an empire. Eveline studied his face, looking for deception, for the manipulation she knew he was capable of, but all she saw was genuine exhaustion, the weight of choices that had broken something fundamental inside him. Why are you telling me this? Because you won. Maybe not militarily, we both know this could still go either way, but you won the thing that actually matters. You stayed human through all of this. You made brutal choices, but you never stopped caring about the cost. You carry the weight of every death. I can see it in your eyes. He moved closer, not threatening, just closing the distance between them. I lost that somewhere, lost the part of me that cared about anything beyond winning. And now I'm standing in ruins of my own making, and I can't even remember what I was trying to win. So what now? You're not offering to surrender. You're too proud for that. No. But I'm offering an end, a real one. We hold a council. Representatives from both sides. Negotiate actual peace terms instead of ultimatums. Transfer power to a transitional government. Let the nobles and military commanders decide the empire's future instead of us forcing our vision on them. And what happens to you? To us? We step back. Both of us. We've done enough damage fighting over a throne neither of us actually deserves. Let someone else carry that weight. Eveline wanted to believe him. Wanted to think that maybe, finally, he was being genuine. But trust had died months ago in a hidden chamber full of letters. And dead things didn't resurrect just because you wanted them to. You tried to have me killed, she said quietly. You forged my signature, stole my family's fortune, planned to replace me like I was defective furniture. And now you want me to believe you've had some kind of moral awakening? No. I want you to believe I'm exhausted and pragmatic enough to recognize when continuing costs more than stopping. I want you to believe that even someone as far gone as me can occasionally see clearly enough to know when a war has become pointless. He pulled something from his pocket, a small leather-bound journal, held it out to her. This contains codes to every secret account I've established, every hidden asset, every piece of leverage I've been holding in reserve. Take it, use it to rebuild what I destroyed, or burn it and let everything collapse. I don't care anymore. Evelyn took the journal slowly, felt its weight. Such a small thing to contain so much stolen wealth. Why should I trust anything in here is real? Because I'm done playing games. Because I looked at casualty reports this morning and realized I couldn't remember half the names of people who died for my ambitions. Because something broke when I understood that everything I'd worked for would be remembered as ashes and cruelty. He met her eyes. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But maybe we can stop adding to the pile of bodies long enough to let someone else clean up the mess we've made. Evelyn wanted to hate him, wanted to feel the rage that had sustained her through weeks of war. But all she felt was tired. So tired of carrying anger like armor. So exhausted from the weight of decisions that had sent people to their deaths. Maybe that was what power actually took from you in the end. Not your morals or your principles or your humanity. Just your energy. Your capacity to keep carrying with the intensity required to sustain righteous fury, until all that remained was exhaustion and the desire for it to finally be over. I need guarantees, she said finally. Real ones, not just your word. Name them. Name. You surrender command of military forces. Submit to independent investigation of your crimes. Accept whatever judgment comes from that investigation without resistance. Done. Blackwood and your generals face the same investigation. No immunity for people who helped you. Agreed. And the Lancaster fortune, everything you stole, returns to my family's control. Reparations for what you took. You can have it all. Every coin. I'm done pretending wealth equals worth. Evelyn studied him for a long moment, trying to see if this was one final manipulation. The ultimate trap. But Adrian looked like someone who'd already surrendered internally. Someone who'd lost the war with himself long before losing it with her. I'll present your offer to my council, she said. They'll want proof you're serious. Public acknowledgement of crimes. Formal cessation of military operations. You'll have it by morning. He turned to leave, stopped after a few steps, looked back at her one last time. For what it's worth, I did love you. In the beginning. Before I ruined it with greed and fear and ambition, you were the best thing I ever had, and I destroyed it because I couldn't tell the difference between partnership and possession. His voice broke on the last word. Evelyn saw tears on his face. Maybe genuine, maybe theatrical. After 10 years of lies, she couldn't tell anymore. I loved you too, she said quietly. Or I loved who I thought you were, the man you pretended to be. But that man never really existed. Just smoke and mirrors and carefully constructed performances. I know. That's the worst part. I spent so long performing strength that I forgot how to be real. And by the time I remembered, I'd already destroyed everything that mattered. He left then, walking away through overgrown gardens toward whatever future awaited him. Evelyn watched him go and felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness, not exactly, but maybe the beginning of letting go. Of releasing the anger that had sustained her but also consumed her. She returned to the palace to find her commanders waiting anxiously, told them about the conversation, about Adrian's offer, about the journal containing access to hidden accounts. The debate lasted hours. Some wanted to reject any terms, execute Adrian publicly as a traitor. Others saw the pragmatic value of ending the war before more people died. Lady Thorne argued for a middle path, accept the surrender but ensure consequences were genuine and public. Near midnight, they reached consensus. Accept Adrian's terms. Hold independent investigations. Transfer power to a transitional council of nobles and military leaders. Both Adrian and Evelyn would step back from direct power while the empire rebuilt. It wasn't perfect. Wasn't the triumphant victory Evelyn had sometimes imagined, but it was an ending, a real one. And maybe that was enough. The next morning, Adrian issued a public statement, acknowledging crimes, accepting responsibility, ordering his forces to stand down. The text was distributed throughout the empire by every available means. The war didn't end instantly. Some fighting continued for days as word spread slowly through contested territories. Some commanders refused to accept the ceasefire. But gradually, inevitably, the violence subsided. Soldiers who'd been killing each other weeks earlier found themselves standing in the same spaces, uncertain and exhausted, trying to figure out what peace actually looked like. The transitional council formed quickly. Nobles and military commanders from both sides. People who'd spent months trying to kill each other now forced to work together rebuilding. It was messy, contentious, full of old grievances and mutual suspicion. But it was also something genuinely new. Power distributed instead of concentrated. Decisions made through negotiation instead of decree. The beginning of something that might eventually become sustainable governance instead of personality-driven tyranny. Adrian was tried publicly for his crimes. The proceedings took weeks. Evidence presented, witnesses called, every stolen coin and forged signature documented in excruciating detail. He sat through it all without defending himself, accepting judgment with the same exhausted resignation he'd shown in the garden. The council debated his sentence for days. Some wanted execution, others exile. Eventually, they settled on permanent house arrest in a remote estate, stripped of titles and authority, allowed to live but never to hold power again. A living reminder of what unchecked ambition cost. Evelyn attended the sentencing, watched Adrian accept his fate without protest. Their eyes met briefly. No words exchanged, just a moment of acknowledgement between two people who had destroyed each other in their attempts to avoid being destroyed. She wondered if he'd find peace in his exile, if someone capable of his crimes could ever really atone. But that wasn't her burden anymore. She'd carried his sins long enough. Time to set them down and figure out who she was without them. The harder question was what happened to her. The council offered her the throne, restoration as empress with real constitutional limits this time. But every time she looked at that seat, all she saw was blood and betrayal and the 1,000 compromises that had brought her here. She declined, shocked everyone by walking away from the power she'd fought so hard to reclaim. Instead, she accepted a position as advisor to the transitional government, voice but not authority, influence but not control. It felt right somehow. She'd learned during the war that she was capable of leading, of making brutal decisions, of carrying the weight of other people's lives. But she'd also learned that power warped people, that even the best intentions corroded under sustained pressure. Better to offer guidance than to rule. Better to help rebuild than to control how rebuilding happened. The palace was converted into a museum, a public space instead of private fortress. The throne room where Adrian had passed judgments and Evelyn had confronted him became an exhibition about the war, documenting crimes, honoring victims, making sure history remembered the cost of unchecked ambition. Evelyn walked through it 6 months after the war ended, looking at displays of letters she'd found, documents she'd risked everything to expose, casualty lists that went on for pages. She stopped at a photograph of Adrian taken during his trial. He looked smaller somehow, diminished, like removing power had revealed how little substance existed underneath. "Your Majesty." She turned. Marion stood there, no longer a servant, now working as administrator for the museum. They'd kept in touch after the war, quiet friendship built on shared survival. "I keep telling you not to call me that." "Old habits." Marion smiled. "How are you?" "Tired. Always tired these days, but alive. That counts for something. More than something. You changed history." Evelyn looked back at the displays, the documented evidence of everything that had happened. "At what cost?" she murmured. "How many people died because I chose war over surrender? How many more would have died if you'd surrendered? If Adrian had eliminated you and continued unchecked?" Marion moved beside her. "You can't know what would have happened in the other timeline. You can only know what happened in this one. And in this one, the Empire survived. Broken, but learning. That's not nothing." Evelyn wanted to believe that, wanted to think all the death and destruction had served some greater purpose. But late at night, when she couldn't sleep, she still saw faces. People who'd died in battles she'd ordered, civilians caught in crossfire, soldiers on both sides who'd just been following commands. The weight of those deaths never really got lighter. She'd just gotten stronger at carrying them. She left the museum as afternoon sun painted the city gold. The capital had healed visibly, buildings repaired, streets cleaned, markets bustling. On the surface, it looked like the war had never happened. But everyone who'd lived through it carried scars. Some visible, most not. The kind of damage that showed up in how people flinched at loud noises, how they hoarded food even when supplies were stable, how they watched strangers with suspicion born from months of not knowing who might betray them. Healing from that kind of collective trauma took generations. Evelyn knew she'd never see the full results of what they'd started. Just the beginning. The first hesitant steps toward something better. She walked to the memorial garden, the one built on the ruins of the palace ballroom where it had all started, where she'd danced with Adrian while his betrayal waited in a hidden chamber, where she'd discovered letters that had killed the woman she'd been and birthed someone harder. The garden was dedicated to everyone who died in the war, names carved in stone, thousands of them, soldiers and civilians, nobles and servants, people from both sides because death didn't care about political allegiance. Evelyn knelt beside the memorial wall, ran her fingers over names she recognized, soldiers who'd followed her orders, civilians who'd been in wrong places, people whose lives had ended because she'd chosen to fight instead of accept her own erasure. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the stone. "I'm so sorry for what I cost you." The words felt inadequate, hollow. But she said them anyway, made herself bear witness to the price of her choices. That's what power demanded in the end. Not glory or triumph or historical legacy, just the willingness to look at consequences without flinching, to carry weight without collapsing, to accept that sometimes there were no good choices, only less terrible ones. She stayed until sunset, until the memorial was bathed in orange light and shadows stretched long across carved names. Then she stood slowly, joints aching, and walked toward the future she'd fought so brutally to make possible. The empire would continue without her direct control, would stumble and recover and occasionally thrive, would make new mistakes and learn from old ones, would slowly, painfully, transform into something more accountable and less dependent on individual rulers. And she would watch it happen from the sidelines, offer advice when asked, share experience when useful, but mostly just live. Find out who Evelyn Lancaster was when she wasn't defined by marriage or war or political necessity. It was terrifying, liberating, the beginning of something she'd never expected to have after everything that had happened. A life, just a life. No throne, no empire, no desperate struggle for survival. Just morning walks and quiet evenings and the slow work of becoming someone she could tolerate seeing in mirrors. That night, alone in a modest house far from the palace, Evelyn stood at her window looking out at the city she'd helped save and nearly destroyed. Lights flickered in thousands of windows. People living their lives, loving and fighting and surviving. The empire continuing regardless of who sat on thrones or won battles. She thought about Adrian in his exile, about whether he'd found any peace, whether people like them, who'd gone so far into darkness, could ever really come back. She thought about the woman she'd been at the winter ball, naive enough to believe discovering betrayal was the worst thing that could happen, young enough to think truth and evidence would be enough to fix broken systems. That woman was gone, dead, killed by cold chambers and forged letters in the brutal education of war. What remained was harder, scarred. Someone who'd learned that survival sometimes required transformation into something you barely recognized. That strength meant carrying unbearable weight without collapsing. That wisdom was just accumulated mistakes viewed from enough distance to see patterns. She'd never be whole again. Never erase the memories of what she'd done and what had been done to her. Never fully wash away the blood on her hands, regardless of how justified each decision had been in the moment. But maybe wholeness was overrated anyway. Maybe the point wasn't to emerge undamaged, but to emerge at all. To keep breathing. Keep moving. Keep trying to do slightly better today than yesterday. She closed the curtains, turned away from the city, prepared for bed like any other person living any other life. Tomorrow she'd wake up, go to her advisory position, help rebuild systems she'd helped break, make small choices that might accumulate into something meaningful over time. Tomorrow and every tomorrow after that. Until eventually, maybe, The weight of the past would ease just enough that she could carry it without it consuming everything else. That was the best ending available. Not triumphant, not redemptive, just survivable. And for someone who'd fought through hell to earn the right to keep existing, survivable was enough. The war was over. The empire was healing. And Queen Evelyn Lancaster, former empress, former rebel, former everything, was learning to live with the woman she'd become. It wasn't the story she'd imagined when she'd discovered those letters. Wasn't the revenge fantasy or the triumphant victory or the perfect justice. It was just an ending, messy and complicated and real. And after everything, that was all she'd really needed, a chance to end, to stop fighting, to rest. The Palace of Love had burned years ago. From its ashes, something stranger and more sustainable had grown. Not love, not hate, just exhausted acceptance and the determination to keep moving forward. She'd survived. They'd all survived, broken and scarred and irrevocably changed, but alive. And sometimes, after everything, that had to be enough.